The story begins with a large crowd of people gathered in the courtyard of a kingdom. They were all waiting for a mysterious person who was supposed to appear any minute. The young woman was told to come out because they had already reached their destination. The main thought in the young lady's mind was that today she would marry a man she knew nothing about. The crowd was just crazy that they finally got to see a young woman from the Western Empire. The men also remarked that this young woman was quite beautiful. The young woman herself was staring intently into the crowd, trying to see the face of her precious husband. But when her eyes caught sight of the man who was supposed to be her fiancé, her eyes widened in surprise. Yes, she remembered that fate had brought them together once before. The young man held out his hand and introduced himself. His name was Cassian, the Duke of Turnagain. He said that he was looking forward to meeting her and was glad to see her in his kingdom. The young man added that here they were meeting again. The shocked young girl could only say, you. The only thought in the young girl's mind, whose name was Arna, was that she was going to marry this man and why fate had decided to play such a cruel joke on her. The two young people met on a very interesting day. It was 3 months ago. There was a magnificent ball in the lands of the Western Empire. The invited guests were dressed in fancy dress and masks. They were talking and drinking wonderful drinks. Pleasant music was playing in the hall and was even more conducive to frank conversations. And only one young woman was sneaking up on the window like some kind of intruder. She was not feeling well, so she moved carefully so as not to lose her balance. It was the day of the imperial banquet. But the young girl had forgotten about it, and she had gotten very drunk with the Knights of the Order the night before. She really hoped that she would not be able to attend it tonight, because it would hardly be her dream to attend social events, because on the contrary, she hated them. But Arn's mom had a completely different opinion, because in the morning she found a girl who had not yet woken up from a night of drunken partying and gave her such a beating that she forced her to come here with threats and ultimatums. So the young girl simply had no other choice. Arna decided to find the emperor, bow to him, and get out of this damn party as soon as possible. On top of all this, Arna overheard 2 maidens discussing that they hadn't seen Arna at tonight's ball either. They also said that the Duchess was furious. Arnie also heard that the Duchess was looking for her everywhere, and this time the young girl would not get away with it, because her mother would catch her, and Arna would live in hell for 30 lifetimes. That's why Arna decided to meet with the emperor secretly from her mother, and then ask him what he thinks about it. The young girl looked around the castle and decided that the emperor was on the 3rd floor at that very moment. So the young girl skillfully jumped onto the windowsill and carefully began to climb the wall to the 3rd floor. She had no lack of skill and grace, so very soon she found herself on the balcony. By a strange coincidence, a young man was standing on that balcony. A rustling noise caught his attention, and he turned his head to see what was going on. Arna, when she landed on the balcony after a successful jump, also noticed that she was not alone and decided to see who was there. She stared at the young, handsome man for a minute and only noticed the blue eyes peeking out from behind the mask. Arna tried to guess who he was, but then remembered that this was the last thing on her mind right now, and she had much more important things to do. The young man decided to help the young girl up and offered her his hand. But Arnie, not paying attention to his offer, jumped onto the balcony and grabbed the ledge and climbed safely to the 3rd floor. The confused young man did not even have time to blink. No sooner had the mysterious lady disappeared from the balcony than several guards came running and asked His Highness what the suspicious sound was. But Cassian replied that nothing dangerous was happening here. The young man also added that a charming stray cat had just run by. He wondered for a minute who it could be. But the young lady sank into the young duke's heart. Meanwhile, Arna was already on the 3rd floor. She looked around carefully and made sure that there was no one in the corridor. That was exactly what the young girl needed to sneak inside unnoticed. One deft move and the young girl was already in the castle. My stomach was unbearably churning. Yesterday's party showed itself. But there was no way back, because the mother would definitely let her skin go. In a couple of minutes, the young girl was already pacing the banquet hall of the imperial palace. She noticed how those present were having a good time. Out of the corner of her eye, the young girl noticed a cute mask lying on the table. For a moment, she thought that it was a stray mask and quickly grabbed it. Arna put it on the go and quickly walked away. One woman looked back to pick up her mask from the table and saw an empty table. She yelled in exasperation. Where was her mask? And that mask had been forgiven a long time ago. When the young girl went to the middle of the hall, she noticed how people surrounded a man. Arna became interested and decided to take a closer look at what was happening there. When Arna came closer, she saw that the man around whom the crowd had gathered was the Emperor of the Western Empire. This was her immediate superior, Sicilian IV, and also by concurrence, her uncle and the Emperor of the Western Empire. Arnie decided that this was the best moment to go say hello to the Emperor and disappear from this damn party. Only she was going to take the first step when she noticed her mother greeting the girl. It was at that moment that Arna heard her mother ask the woman if she had seen her daughter, because she was going to kill her as soon as she found her. And Rosalia Brilt's character was so militant. And this, as no one else knew Arna, who had already felt it on her own skin more than once. The only thing the young girl decided to do after hearing these words was to turn 180 degrees and walk towards the exit as quickly as possible. That was what could save Arna from her mother's wrath. The interlocutor of the Duchess noted that perhaps the Duchess cannot find her daughter because everyone here is wearing masks? But the Duchess replied that Arna had no idea what a masquerade ball was. Arna walked quickly down the corridor, and her mother and her friend followed her. 7 sweats broke out from the young girl. She cursed everything in the world for following exactly her footsteps. The young girl noticed a turn to another corridor and decided to hide there, because to run into Mom in this hot moment. The Duchess complained all the way about her short-lived daughter. Arne hid behind the corner of the corridor and was shaking with fear. She simply asked with all the power of heaven and earth that the mother would pass this turn and not find her frightened daughter. But nothing in this castle could be hidden from the watchful eye of the Duchess. She immediately noticed that someone was there and decided to make sure that her daughter was there. Arna closed her eyes and was afraid to even breathe. Only the thought that she would be caught now and everything would be over was running through her head. Then she felt someone approaching and had already prepared for the worst. But when Arna opened her eyes and got ready to shake off a kind kick from her mother, she saw that she was in the arms of a young man whom she had already met on the balcony. She just had time to ask if they had met before, and the young man put his finger to his lips and motioned for her to behave as quietly as possible. He finally found his magical cat. The Duchess, who turned into this corridor and saw the young couple embracing, began to apologize for disturbing their peace. But the young Duke replied that everything was fine and there was no need to apologize. The Duchess noticed that the young man was hiding the girl with his cloak, so she asked what kind of girl was next to him. Cassian explained that his companion is shy, so she does not want to show her face. And the Duchess smiled and said that in such a case she would not disturb them and went away. Arna was able to breathe a sigh of relief under Cassian's cover. The danger has passed. But she could not understand why he saved her, just like last time. The young man turned to Arna and asked if she had found what she was looking for an hour ago on the balcony. And the young girl just looked at the Duke with a questioning look. Cassian said it looked like the young girl was an uninvited guest here, and she asked why he behaved so calmly in such a case, since he knows that the girl was not invited here. The young man smiled back at her and said he was just curious. At the same time, Arna carefully looked into his eyes and tried to remember whether she had ever seen him in these parts before today. Then she decided that he was a foreigner. The young man explained with a smile on his face that he was simply interested in one charming stray cat. And Arna began to ponder over his words. Why the cat in particular? Then she guessed that it was precisely because she had climbed onto the balcony. From the young man's satisfied face, Arnie understood that she had guessed why he called her a stray cat. But Arna's stomach twisted sharply, and she could no longer chatter. Therefore, the young girl politely apologized and said that first of all she thanked him for his help. Then she added that she would return later and thank him for his kindness. Then Arna took out some coat of arms and put it in the young man's hand. She said she was leaving it as a thank you. Before Cassian could say anything, the young girl turned and, saying that she was in a hurry, quickly walked away. The confused young man just stared at his cat. As soon as Arnie left the corridor, an assistant approached Cassian and asked what he was holding in his hands. The man noticed how His Highness was carefully examining that order. But in his voice, His Highness only said that he did not know for sure what kind of order it was. And in his thoughts, he added that this is probably what a cat's gratitude for help looks like. The aide couldn't figure out why His Highness looked so pleased, and what had happened while he was away. Cassian then asked what was the matter that he was so worried. and the man reported that the emperor was calling the duke to him. His Highness replied that they had no right to keep the emperor waiting. Compared to the northern empire where Cassian came from, the local lands are much more fertile and rich. However, all these merits were due to only one man, the master of the sword, Revelgos, the shield of the Western Empire. Throughout history, only 100 men have been awarded the knowledge of a master of the sword. In addition, most of the sword masters were from the Western Empire, who were always loyal to their homeland. Moreover, he saved his country from destruction. Cassian was eager to meet the swordsman in person, who, after so many accomplishments, gave no reason to doubt his greatness. But the emperor only smiled in response. Because it was almost impossible to meet the master of the sword. After all, he did not come even when the emperor called him personally. The emperor added that the swordmaster was ignoring even the emperor's orders. Then he added that the boy should not think that he was speaking to the master, he was just that kind of person. The emperor himself almost lost control of his emotions, because he knew that the master of the sword was Lady Arna, and if it was known in other countries, then the Duchess would simply be mad about it. The Duchess was always in a bad mood for her daughter's constant opposition to her marriage. And who would marry a girl who was famous among the people as a master of the sword? A commotion distracted Cassian from his thoughts. He turned his head and saw how the Duchess had found his cat after all, and was dragging her by the ear to give her a good rub. Cassian looked in their direction with a dreamy look, and thought that his wiry cat had been caught after all. The emperor himself distracted him from his thoughts. Cyclone IV proposed to His Highness to return to the conversation about arranging a marriage between their countries. Then the emperor asked if the duke had already liked someone among the local girls. In fact, this ball was arranged so that Sir Cassian would find himself the most worthy match, which would contribute to the establishment of harmony between the Western and Northern empires. The emperor asked if the young man already had someone on his notice, and Cassian said thoughtfully that he didn't even know. His Highness thought for a moment. The girl's status was not important to Cassian. The main thing was that she fit all the criteria. And if she is an interesting person, it will be even better. An image of his cat immediately appeared in his head. Then Cassian took out the order that the girl had given him when she said goodbye, and promised to return and thank the duke. Therefore, he put the order on the table and said that it was a thing of a girl who liked it. The emperor was almost speechless. The coat of arms of the House of Arna lay on the table in front of him. Meanwhile, the duke only added that he would happily marry the young lady to whom this thing belonged. The peak of the military strength of the Western Empire, its savior hero, who was respected by every inhabitant of the country, was Lady Arni, and she was also the head of the Order of the Golden Dragon, on whose shoulders was the entire defense of the country. That's the kind of person Arni was built, the most respected swordsman. But despite all her merits and regalia, this belligerent young girl remained a daughter. Before going to bed, a mother visited her room, who was trying her best to persuade her disobedient daughter to marry a worthy duke from the northern kingdom. She thought that at home she remained only a naughty daughter, who was trying to push some man. Arna was wandering somewhere in her thoughts until her mother sternly asked if she was listening to her. The young girl thought that she could just jump out of the window and her torment would be over. Meanwhile, the mother continued to praise her next defendant. The Duchess said that the count from the neighboring empire was simply wonderful, and that he was destined for the girl by fate itself. All her peers have long known the joy of marriage, because love is simply wonderful. The girl furrowed her brows and waited for her mother to talk and leave her alone. But today, their conversation dragged on longer than usual. Therefore, she mentally distorted all her mother's sentences. Then the mother asked her daughter if she knew what nickname she was given in society. Arna asked if he could be a swordsman, and his mother said no. Then the girl assumed that the hero was a savior. The mother again said that her daughter did not guess. And Arna thought more carefully about her nickname. After thinking a little, it occurred to the young girl that she was called a mad dog, and the mother added that not just a rabid dog, but the emperor's rabid dog. Arna thought that sounded pretty good. The Duchess complained to Arna that even if she ever started talking about an engagement, all the boys just ran away because Arna once spanked them all. And Arnie just said that they were all weaklings. That's why they got paid for nuts by the girl. The angry Duchess slapped her naughty daughter on the back because she didn't know how else to talk to her. The Duchess fell exhausted into a chair and said that she only wanted her daughter to be happy, which is why she insisted on getting married as soon as possible. Offended, Arna looked at her mother and tearfully asked if a woman's happiness consisted only in marriage. The mother replied that, of course, every woman has her own happiness. The mother did not know what other arguments to give, so she simply told Arna to live as she knew. But her heart bleeds when she sees how her daughter cannot find love. Arnie looked at her mother and repeated the word love in her mind, but she didn't say anything to her, and it didn't resonate in her heart. A word as a word. But the mother decided to bring her conversation to the end and informed her daughter that a suitable partner had already been chosen for her. The emperor himself took care of it. Confused, Arna shouted, "Who else do they want to introduce to her?" And the mother informed that her fiancé's name is the Duke of Turnagain from the Northern Empire. The Duchess also said that if rumors are to be believed, he is the first groom in the Northern Empire. Every lady would be lucky to marry such a rich, handsome man. And Arna simply exploded with emotions. She cried out, how dare they marry her off to a foreigner? And the mother shouted back that no one in their country wanted to marry Arna. That disobedient daughter did not even want to listen to her mother's arguments and shouted that she would not marry a man she had never even seen for anything in the world. The mother said that who would marry her if not this young man? And she calmly added that her daughter should try to just meet him, and that way they would understand whether they fit each other or not. The Duchess also added that the ladies would be dazzled by his beauty. And isn't it a blessing to be married to such a handsome man? But Arna only angrily shouted for her mother to stop this chatter. That was the end of the conversation. But every day, at the right opportunity, the mother constantly reminded Arne that this union would be simply incredible for everyone, both for the countries and for the young people themselves. And a week passed, and the mother did not stop telling what a skilled knight the Duke was, and he also came from a noble family. And when 2 weeks of these endless persuasions had passed, the mother very much begged to fulfill her last request and marry that Duke. Arna no longer had the strength to argue every day. On the same day, Arnie agreed to look at her fiancé only so that the annoying mother would get away from her and not bother her daughter with talks about that damn Duke. On the day of the examination, thoughts in Arna's head were just raging. She could not realize that she would marry a foreigner, and that too in another country. She lived alone and was happy until today. The mother could not stop and constantly told them what a beautiful daughter they had, and how these clothes fit her, and what beautiful jewels complemented her fabulous image. The mother drove her daughter because she thought that the Duke of Turnagain was already waiting for them. But Arna looked at her mother with a disbelieving look, and she had no desire to go to this betrothed. In Arna's head, which amused the young girl at least a little, she thought that she could easily make that Duke refuse to marry at all. The maid informed the ladies that the meeting with the Duke would take place in the reception room, in this very room. Arna looked around and began to examine the Duke's beautifully decorated room. Arna displeasedly asked her mother if she had to accompany Arna here as well. The Duchess replied that her father and the Duke would soon be here. Arna thought for a moment that what she came up with would be complete suicide for her. But the prospect of marrying a stranger was even less appealing. The Duchess chatted cheerfully with the maid, praising the local interior, and the maid informed that the Duke was personally furnishing the entire castle. Arnie went to the window and decided that she simply had no other way out. Because from minute to minute, His Highness will appear here, and her will come to a final end. The young girl opened the window and cautiously looked at her mother and maid. They did not pay attention to the girl and just talked. Arna decided to simply run away from this engagement. The Duchess was the first to hear how a fresh wind blew from the street, and a terrible thought flashed through her head. The woman simply did not want to even think about such a thing. But when the women turned their heads in the direction of fresh air, they saw an empty room and an open window. The Duchess's eyes nearly popped out of surprise and shame for her daughter. The enraged Duchess shouted the name of her disobedient daughter and gripped her fan so furiously that it cracked and broke in two. She did not expect such a reason from her daughter on the day of the examinations. Meanwhile, confused, Arna looked around and looked into the open window. There was no way back. The young girl looked at the garden in which she found herself and thought about what she should do next. Then Arna heard the sound of hooves and turned her head. She saw a carriage approaching this castle. The girl decided to come closer. A moment later, the young girl was already running to the carriage. She decided to use the cruise services for a short time to get away from this cursed place. She ran to the door and grabbed the door handle. A young man inside heard someone trying to get inside the carriage. But when the door of the carriage opened, both young people were shocked by what they saw. They never expected to see each other under such circumstances. For the first few minutes, they just stared at each other in silence. The first to speak was Cassian, who said he was glad to see his stray cat again. They just said the word, "you." Arna heard someone shouting loudly for her to stay where she was and not to move. The young girl turned her head in fear and saw her angry mother. Arnie simply had no choice, and she resolutely climbed into the carriage and sat opposite the young man. Because if her angry mother caught up with her, she would flay her in front of everyone. The young duke just looked at his cat and was amazed by her determination. She attracted him even more when she acted so impulsively. Arnie only apologized for the inconvenience and said that they could go on. The bullets were headed for it. Cassian had only told the young woman that she looked as if she was trying to escape from an unwanted marriage. The angry girl just gave him an incredulous look. His Highness only added that she could use the young man, if, of course, she wished it, and there was some necessity for it. In the head of the confused girl, only questions arose. Why this young man always happens to her at the most dangerous moment and offers his help. Arnie also thought that maybe he was some kind of fraud, and what would he ask in exchange for her request? But Cassian saw the girl's hesitation and said that he did not need anything in return for help. At first she thought he read her mind. Then she guessed that maybe he was just curious and should take advantage of this opportunity, especially if he wasn't asking for anything in return. She thought a little and said that she would agree to accept the young man's help. Cassian just smiled back and said it was just great. The young girl nevertheless dared and asked the young man to pretend to be her young boyfriend just for one day. His Highness smiled with satisfaction and said that he would accept this request as an honor for himself and would gladly play along with the young lady. Meanwhile, the carriage slowly moved away and the young people went on their way. She had no idea where they were going, but she didn't care as long as they were away from her fiancé. After a few minutes, the young girl still wondered where they were going, so she asked the young man about it. And he, without thinking for a long time, said that they were going on a date. Arn's face changed. She looked at the young man with such a look that she wanted to kill him. Her eyes read only the question of what the hell is a date. Cassian smiled and explained that she herself had asked him to pretend to be her boyfriend, which was why they were going on a date. Then the young man added that they should show the whole world that they are a real couple. At these words, Arna thought that it looked like he was already bending the stick to the whole world. But Cassian had his iron argument on this matter. He explained that if rumors spread that she has a lover, then the engagement will definitely be postponed. After listening to all the arguments of the young man, Arna agreed that it was just a brilliant idea, and this is how they could break this silence forever. A satisfied smile spread across the young man's face. When the carriage stopped, Cassian invited the young lady to go with him to the cafe. He ordered a dessert and explained to the girl that it was a very famous dessert in this empire. Cassian noticed with his side vision that the audience had already begun to whisper. These girls already recognized that Lady Arnie was sitting next to him and began to thoroughly wash her bones. Even the girls couldn't recognize what kind of handsome man was next to Arna and decided to just go up and ask. Meanwhile, Arna was looking at the amazing dessert. She was not used to sweets. The young girl was used to hard battles, but not at all to delicacies. So after the first bite, she was so enraptured by the taste that she even closed her eyes with pleasure. The young man noticed that Arna had a piece of dessert left on his lips, so he asked the young woman if she wanted to be informed about her new young man sooner. Arna did not have time to react to this question and give his answer, as the hand of His Highness reached to her lips and he took a piece of dessert that was there. Then he put that piece in his mouth and said that this dessert was truly unsurpassed and that the rumors were not lying, praising it on all sides. Cassian smiled at the young girl and said that this was the quickest way to tell everyone that they were a couple. Those present, who kept their eyes on the young couple, already began to whisper, but Arna was not laughing. She was just raging. The only thing pulsating in his head was the thought of what a jerk he was making in front of everyone present. As they said goodbye at the gate, Arna thanked the young man for today, and he replied with satisfaction that he was glad to help his stray cat. Arnie thought to herself that she even enjoyed their date, even though she thought it would be boring. But most of all, she was glad that now rumors would spread that she had a young husband. Arna happily thanked the young man for his help and said that she would definitely repay him the debt for the service. She was very pleased that the cursed marriage was over. The young man saw that the beauty was very pleased and said that she would have to make a good effort to repay the debt. Then the young man asked Arna why it was so difficult for her to accept just the thought of marriage, although she herself said that she had never seen her fiancé in her life. The young girl thought about it and said that this marriage was just a wishful thinking of her parents, who did not even ask about the feelings of the girl herself. That is why she does not think of getting married. Without thinking long, Arna decided to ask her married sister for advice. The sister thought about it and said that the Duke of the Northern Empire must have already been married, and she is still a virgin. The sister added that there is some trick in this marriage, because a man with such a high status cannot not be married, or he wants to cover up his murky affairs with other ladies with this marriage. After listening to her sister, Arna agreed that the man who agreed to marry her was definitely not in his right mind, and she herself is simply annoyed by the thought that she will have to leave her native land and even more so marry and live with some foreigner, and even in another country. She doesn't even want to think about it. This was the first time in his life that such comments were made about the Duke of the Northern Empire. If only he could hear it, he wouldn't believe his ears. Meanwhile, rumors were already spreading throughout the empire. The girls discussed that Lady Arna had a young man, and besides, such a handsome man that one could not take his eyes off him. The emperor learned about this news from a local newspaper. By the time he read it to the end, he was sweating profusely. Arna was sure that the engagement was broken. The young girl began to calm down and was glad that this story had come to an end. Arna decided to go about her daily business, and as she was heading to the study, her mother called her. The Duchess said with a smile on her face that she admired her daughter's courage to go on a date with a man during her engagement, but she would not mind at all if Arna married him. Upon hearing such news, drops of cold sweat appeared on the young girl's forehead. But the Duchess continued that the Duke of Ternugensky himself informed that the rumors were of no importance to him. The mother smiled, which made Arna uneasy. Then the Duchess said that she did not ask much, just that Arna should choose one of these two young men and marry him. Arna cursed herself, but only one thing was clear: her plan failed. Therefore, the young girl decided to tell the whole truth to her mother's face. She gathered courage and said loudly that she did not want to marry anyone at all. The Duchess looked at her daughter with frightened eyes and sat down in a chair. Terrified, Arna waited for her mother's reaction after her categorical statement. She knew her character well, so the consequences could be unpredictable. But the Duchess, after thinking a little, said the following: "If Arna stays married for 3 months and her husband continues to be unpleasant, then she can divorce him and return home." Such a statement struck Arna. She had at least some hope of returning to her usual activities, even after 3 months. The mother sternly added that Arna would have to tame her temper and live quietly. This was her main condition. And if, after all the efforts, Arna's opinion does not change, the mother will never hint at marriage. When Arna heard the terms of their agreement, 3 months seemed to her to be a rather short period, and she quickly nodded her head in agreement. The Duchess added that fights and murders are also strictly prohibited, because the Duchess will personally deal with the disobedient daughter in such a case. Arna said that although it was difficult, she could do it. Arna's marriage contract was concluded. The news that she was getting married shook the entire Western Empire. It was discussed by almost all residents and printed in all the columns of newspapers. The news concerning the marriage of Lady Arna was also discussed at the military meeting. Someone suggested that when the young lady left, they would lose their fighting power. Someone shouted that His Highness did not think at all about who would inspire the army and skillfully guard their borders. But the Emperor was adamant in his decision. He said that he was going to present Lady Arna with the title of Princess of the Western Empire and treat her accordingly. The Emperor then turned his head to the confused girl and said loudly that Arna was the future of the Western Empire. The young girl was completely confused and did not know how to behave in the status of a princess. She thought that Uncle was bending the stick a little, and now it would be even more difficult for her. At the same time, in the Northern Empire, the court was also discussing the news concerning the marriage of their Duke of Ternuggen. After learning this news, the young girl with green eyes was simply mad. She did not understand what kind of old man the Duke decided to take this step so quickly. After all, Cassian was the son of the Emperor and second in line to the throne. He also ranked first among the most desirable grooms in terms of compatibility. And now, the most cherished dream of every young girl of the Northern Empire, to be next to the Duke in the status of his wife, has simply gone to hell. Cassian's marriage simply spread throughout the Northern Empire. She made such a fuss that only the dumb did not discuss her, and only Duke Cassian himself, who was the cause of such an explosive news, remained as calm as possible. He was in his office doing his daily business. When his assistant came to him, His Highness asked if he had not managed to learn something new, and the assistant guiltily reported that nothing more could be clarified. Cassian closed his eyes and began to recall in detail everything that happened that day at the ball. He was sure that when he asked the Emperor about the Swordmaster, the Emperor was 100% nervous. But maybe it just seemed to Cassian he could not understand. But then he was brought back from Cassian's thoughts to reality by the words of the assistant, who said that he was still worried about something. The Duke told him to say what exactly. The aide said that if rumors are to be believed, Duke Brilkt has a problem child. She has very high hopes, but she has been called a mad dog. The assistant also added that the reason why it is difficult to dig up something about Duke Brilkt lies precisely in this rabid dog. This interested Cassian, and he asked to tell what had been found about this rabid dog. And the man said that one should only say something wrong, and this mad dog will beat everyone to death. After this, His Highness thought even more. He could not even imagine that such a cruel rabid dog and his stray cat were from the same family. His Highness again remembered the beautiful bride, and now it became even more interesting for him to solve this riddle. A smile curled on his face, and the young man was already anticipating his married life with this mysterious girl. His thoughts were interrupted by the news that the airship had already arrived. And it is in him that his bride should arrive. Cassian quickly got up from his chair and decided to immediately go to meet his bride. He was sure that Arna would be very surprised when he saw who would become her husband. When the airship appeared in the Northern Empire, the young girl went over the assumptions in her head, what exactly her husband would look like. Her nanny loudly announced that the airship was about to land, so they should get ready to leave. After a few more seconds, the nanny added that Arna would not think of killing the groom. The young girl looked at the nanny in surprise. She did not expect to hear such instructions. That woman continued that you can't beat people just because you don't like them, and all the more to put your sword into action and swing it all the time. The nanny continued that the girl should smile all the time, speak in a sweet voice, always be graceful and elegant. After these words, Arna wondered what kind of monster the nanny thought she was. A huge crowd had already gathered at the place where the airship was supposed to land. Everyone gathered to see who the first groom in the Northern Empire chose. As soon as they landed, the nanny announced that they had to leave. As soon as the door began to open, the young girl took a full chest of air and dared to take the first step into her new life. There, someone loudly announced that Her Excellency Arnie had arrived. But as soon as the young girl saw her future husband, she almost lost consciousness. Cassian himself was surprisingly calm and said that he was glad to see her in his kingdom. The young man added that he was Cassian Ternugensky, and they met again. But the angry Arnie could not utter a sentence. She only repeated, "You, you." All the puzzles instantly came together in her head. She remembered that day of inspections and understood why exactly she saw him then in the crew. She couldn't imagine how it was possible to make fun of her like that. If she had a sword at hand, she would have cut off this wretch's head without a second thought. The outraged young girl abruptly turned 180 degrees and strode decisively towards the airship. The confused nanny just blinked her eyes. Arnie shouted to her nanny that they were returning home immediately and that she should climb into the airship. The mood of the young girl was decisive, and the nanny understood that this was the final decision. And His Highness and the nanny called the young girl, but she did not think to listen to any of them. Arna decided to break the deal with her mother and return home immediately, but His Highness was not confused. He was counting on this reaction of his bride. Therefore, he quickly caught up with the angry girl and whispered in her ear that she promised to return the debt. After these words, Arnie's eyes almost sparkled. She was already ready to kill this brat, but she heard her nanny scream loudly. She shouted for His Highness to be careful. When the young people turned and looked at the nanny, the woman quickly added that the young lady was very weak. The nanny also added that Lady Arna should be treated like a precious crystal so as not to harm her in any way. After these words, Arna came to her senses a little. The next morning, the frightened maids searched for their mistress. They shouted from the front, asking her where she was, because they asked her not to walk alone. The maid was afraid that Lady Arna was walking somewhere alone in such heat, because her delicate skin could be seriously damaged. And it was not worth allowing such a thing before marriage. Her future husband watched this picture from the window of the castle. He noticed how his future wife was sitting on a tree, and the maids were already falling off their feet, looking for her all over the garden. Cassian was only interested in the question of how such a fragile young girl was able to climb such a tall tree. His Highness had the impression that he had picked up a stray cat instead of finding a wife. He admired his future wife for a few more minutes. The young girl felt a chill run down her spine. She knew this feeling well, and it always meant only one thing. She was noticed. Arna turned her head and tried to get a good look at everything. Her gaze went to the window, from where His Highness had been watching her a few minutes ago. She was sure that she was being watched from there. But in order to understand everything, first you had to get down to earth. Arna deftly jumped from the tree and was down in a few seconds. The young girl managed to hide behind a tree trunk so that the maids would not notice her. They still did not lose hope of finding the young girl and continued to call her loudly. Then the maids decided that perhaps their mistress had gone in another direction and they should look for her there. The maids went to look for her further. As soon as Arnie saw that the maids had moved on, she breathed a sigh of relief and said aloud that they hadn't noticed. But then, she heard someone ask what exactly they hadn't noticed. Frightened, the young girl turned to the side where the voice was coming from and almost fell. There stood her future husband, Cassian. Arne gathered herself as quickly as she could and asked how long he had been standing here. There was one more question in my head. Why is he so calm? But His Highness answered that not for long. The young girl gave Cassian a displeased look. She was trying to figure out if he had seen her jump from the tree or if he had come later. He noticed that look and with a smile on his face asked if it was true that she liked him very much. Arnie's eyes widened even more. But Cassian calmly explained that if she was looking at him so intently without even blinking, there was a chance she might like his face. The young girl thought about how to answer him and did not come up with one yet. Then simply stumbling along, she began to invent something. Cassian, on the other hand, watched how the young girl was confused and was glad that it was a pleasure to tease her. He then asked what it was like to meet your husband against your will. Arne did not hesitate to answer that it was not so bad. The surprised Duke asked what she meant. The frowning young girl examined His Highness more carefully. She washed away the fact that she did not notice any flaws in him. She decided it might be worth asking frankly if he had someone on the side. They just stared at each other in silence for a long time. None of them dared to say anything. Everyone was in their own thoughts. Cassian decided to break the silence first. He said that the young girl was standing in front of him, although it was obvious to the naked eye that she was thinking about something completely different. Arnie thought a little more about whether she should answer his question honestly, or whether it was still better to behave as a real lady should at first. Then she still dared and asked His Highness where he learned such flattering maenads of conversation, and she advised him not to forget that they are not yet married. The young Duke looked Arne straight in the eyes and said that it was an easy matter to fix. Then the young man extended his hand to the young girl and gently took her hand. At that moment, she first thought of pulling her hand out, but then she wondered what he would do next. Cassian pulled her hand to his face and paused for a moment. He looked at her again and watched her reaction. Arnie just blinked her eyes in confusion. Then His Highness brought the young girl's hand close to his lips, and hot lips touched Arne's tender skin. Goosebumps ran over the girl's skin. He quietly said that it was too late to run. On that day, the Turnujin castle was full of commotion and excessive running around. From the very early morning, the maids ran around all floors without squatting, trying to do everything by a certain time. And there was only one good reason for this. The owner of the castle was getting married today. The tearful nanny could not control her emotions and insisted that Lady Arna was as beautiful as ever today. The nanny was upset that the Duchess did not see how grown-up and beautiful her daughter was now. But Arna reassured the nanny and said that she spoke of the Duchess as if she had given her soul to God. Suddenly, a mother's voice was heard, saying that it was a pity that she could not personally be present at her daughter's wedding. Arna looked at the magic sphere and said that she still sees everything. Arna with her, and her uncle had personally arrived in the Northern Empire to attend the ceremony. Arna almost stopped breathing after such a statement. She was simply shocked by such attention from her relatives and wondered how she would have to deal with all the consequences after the divorce. But while disturbing thoughts were raging in the young girl's head, the maids had already finished decorating the bride and were the last to put the veil on her face. The maid's voice was heard that everything was ready, and in a few minutes, the beautifully dressed bride was already ready for marriage. All the maids couldn't be more pleased with how incredibly beautiful Arna was. The young girl went to the mirror and examined herself from head to toe. She was not in a festive mood, but the maids encouraged her with their compliments and joyful cries. The young girl closed her eyes and thought that she could not believe that she would have to go through all this, although in fact she did not even want to marry without love. The joyful nanny brought a magic sphere to Arnie, and the girl saw her mother there. The Duchess said that her beautiful daughter shines like a star in the sky in her wedding dress. The happy Duchess smiled and said that she congratulated her daughter on the birth of a new family. There were tears of joy in her eyes, and Arna had never seen her mother so happy in her life. The young girl also tried to smile back, so as not to upset her mother, and thanked her for the greeting. She reassured herself that at least her mother would be happy. A lot of people gathered in the wedding hall. They were invited here from different parts of the country, who were very interested in who could conquer the heart of their duke. Only the duke's assistant, who was watching this process from the upper floor, thought intensely why this wedding was happening so unexpectedly. The assistant saw everyone present discussing the wedding. They asked each other what Circassian's chosen bride imagined herself to be. And didn't the duke fall in love with this girl at first sight? There was only one question in the man's mind. What was his duke even thinking about when he proposed marriage to Lady Arna? After all, this marriage now fell like snow on their heads. A loud announcement was made in the hall for everyone to congratulate the bride and groom. The door to the hall opened solemnly, and a young couple entered the hall holding hands. They were incredibly beautiful. There was a whisper in the hall that the bride was a true beauty, and that now it was clear why their duke had lost his head. All the way to the altar, Arna thought only of whether she was doing the right thing. The young man kept his eyes on his bride. He understood what was going on in her heart now, so he decided not to bother her with unnecessary chatter. When the young couple was in front of the altar, the priest announced that first of all he wanted to thank on behalf of the newlyweds all the guests who attended this solemn event today. Then the priest seriously asked the bride if she swears that she will always love the groom in sorrow and joy, in wealth and poverty, in sickness and in health. Lady Arn glanced at the priest with a frightened look. She could not yet realize that right now her free life was ending, and what this terrible word forever meant. The young girl lowered her head and hesitated to answer. She began to wonder if it was okay to make a false oath before the altar. But she had no other choice, and she quietly said that she swears. The priest then asked the groom the same. Without a moment's hesitation, Cassian said clearly that he swears. He was pleased that Arnie also answered this question in the affirmative. As soon as the bride and groom confirmed their union with their consent, the priest said that after that they should seal their vows with a kiss. The young girl looked fearfully at the priest, and then at her husband. She had no idea that she would have to kiss a stranger in front of everyone present. But His Highness was not confused. He approached the young girl and carefully lifted the veil. Then he looked into her eyes, full of fear. His hand gently took her chin. His Highness quietly told his bride that if she wanted to escape, this was her last chance. But Arna looked at him sternly and said that he himself recently said that it was too late to run away. His blue eyes looked straight into her soul. He gently whispered that of course it was too late to run away. Then suddenly, his other hand wrapped around her waist and pulled her closer to him with a light movement. Arna's heart beat faster. She closed her eyes. After a few seconds, she felt his hot lips touching hers. She didn't know how to describe her feelings, but they certainly weren't disgusting. Everyone present in the hall began to applaud and joyfully congratulate the newlyweds on the birth of their new family. After the kiss, Arna's face was covered with red paint. The priest joyfully announced that from this moment on he was declaring Circassian, Duke of Ternugan, and Lady Arna husband and wife. Arnie's husband looked at his wife with satisfaction. A gentle smile appeared on his face. The young girl could not realize that all this was happening to her in reality. All the guests had fun for a long time and drank alcoholic beverages in honor of the husband and wife. The maids escorted the wife herself to her room. They told her that she needed to rest. The maids tired Arn very much because of their moderate care. They said she might fall because she had been out in high heels all evening. But Arn said in her mind that she would handle everything herself. When the dear young girl remembered her own wedding, the episode with their kiss immediately appeared in her head. This was the highlight of tonight's episode. Immediately after the memories, a blush appeared on her face again. She glanced out of the corner of her eye to see if the maids noticed, for she was not used to showing her weak points to strangers. Arnie was angry with herself for even thinking about that cursed kiss. She told herself to just forget about the kiss once and for all. After a few minutes, the young girl and the maids found themselves in front of the door to a room. The maids announced that they had come to the Duke's chambers. When Arna was inside and looked around, she thought that the room looked even better than she could have imagined. She immediately turned her attention to the large bed in the middle of the room. The young wife immediately fell on the bed. Today was an extremely stressful and difficult day, and her only desire at the moment was just to rest. She immediately began to wonder what was going on. Everything was like a dream for her. Arna could not understand whether she had done the right thing and whether she would not regret it in the future. She was brought back to reality by the maids closing the bedroom door and giggling merrily. They wished the young wife a good wedding night. In Arna's head, their words simply repeated themselves as terribly as possible. It finally dawned on her what exactly they meant. And it looks like one kiss won't end today. The young wife immediately decided that she could not just sit here like that, because she did not want to become known to everyone as a wife who killed her own husband on their first wedding night. At that moment, the only right decision for Arna seemed to be escape. She resolutely went to the window and opened it. The young girl surveyed the area and assessed how exactly she would need to go down. Arna decided that this was her way to retreat, and there was no more time to delay the decision. But just as Arna decided to take her first step towards escape, her husband's displeased voice was heard from behind. He sternly asked what she was doing there. Arna turned her head and looked into her husband's blue eyes. Here it was clear even to a dull person that his look did not predict anything good. The young wife was confused and did not know what to do, whether to quickly jump out of the window or to come up with something again and stay in her husband's bedroom. But it was only known that she was caught again. The young man saw that his wife hesitated and could not think of what to say to him. Therefore, he did not hesitate to repeat his question. Arna, standing on the windowsill of his bedroom, continued to decide what she should do. She had two options, either cut him down immediately or tell him the whole truth. Cassian repeated what she was going to do. Arna still decided to say that she just decided to get some fresh air, so she moved closer to the window. But her explanation did not look very convincing. Therefore, Cassian asked why she decided to breathe fresh air precisely on the windowsill and in the middle of the night. The young wife again began to mumble something that was not very clear, and Cassian asked if she was going to end her own life right now. Such a young girl could not even think. She looked at her husband and thought, what is he doing at all, and how did such a thing even come into his head? Arnie clearly answered that she was not going to do that at all. In her mind, she even wondered if it was possible to die by jumping from here. Cassian looked at his wife and decided not to continue this conversation, so as not to scare the girl, and she did not decide to do something else for the night watching. Arnie also decided to leave this little misunderstanding alone. After all, she couldn't tell him frankly that she was going to run away from him on their wedding night. His Highness cautiously began to approach his wife. He quietly took one step at a time, trying not to scare her even more. When he came almost close to her, he held out his hand to her. Arna looked at her and hesitated whether she should respond in kind or leave things as they were. But after thinking a little, she still decided to extend her hand to him. As soon as he took her hand, he carefully took the young wife from the windowsill. When Arna was right next to Cassian, he gently told her to never neglect her safety again. She silently looked into his eyes and only shook her head. She chaotically tried to think of what to do now, and nothing came to mind, except that I would have to spend the night with him. One thing she knew for sure was that if she had to do it today, then she would definitely become the wife who killed her husband on their first wedding night. Cassian's mind immediately had a picture of her nanny warning him to treat Lady Arna like a crystal because she was too weak. Even then, His Highness understood that he should be as careful as possible with his wife. but he did not think that her relatives had driven her to the point of suicide. When he looked into her eyes, Arna still hesitated as to what to do to her. She simply said that she was in such a stupid situation and thought that it was not too late to cut him down. He was silent for a while, carefully choosing the necessary words, and then turned to his wife. She looked fearfully at the young man. Then His Highness suddenly took his wife in his arms and carried her somewhere. He kept his eyes on his wife, and she also looked into his blue eyes. A blush appeared on Arna's cheeks from the very thoughts of what might happen when he brought her to bed. She didn't want to spend the night with a man she didn't even know. When Arna was in bed, her husband gently covered her with a blanket, while she curled up, imagining what they would have to do now, and her heart almost stopped from those thoughts. She was waiting for her husband to start molesting her, and did not know how she would be able to endure it. But when she opened her eyes, she saw Cassian standing next to her, and said that she was very tired today. Confused, Arna looked at him with wide eyes and could not believe her ears. She asked herself whether it was possible to just sleep on the first wedding night. The young man leaned closer to his wife and whispered to her not to worry about anything, but to just close her eyes and get a good night's sleep. Cassian then turned and walked out of the bedroom. When Arn heard the door close, she was able to relax and breathe freely. Now was the time to reflect on everything that happened today. When she found herself alone with her thoughts, she thought that now everything was exactly as she wanted it to be. But it is somewhat strange that His Highness behaves with Arna as if with a child. For aristocrats, marriage was a common thing, a kind of simple tool, a union that pursued only one goal: family well-being. Therefore, everyone thought that this is exactly how the marriage of the Duke of Ternugensky is. She washed the bones of both the bride and the groom long before the ceremony itself. It was like this until everyone saw the young couple at the wedding. It was then that everyone noticed how His Highness looked at his wife and kept their eyes on the young couple, trying not to miss a single detail. But the absence of the young wife at half of the banquet, as well as the extraordinary care of the maids for the young wife, gave rise to too many rumors about the young girl herself. Even at the banquet, the guests began to whisper that missing their own wedding was too much. And it is very suspicious that the dukes are so protective of their new wife. The men quietly whispered the story that His Highness had personally chased away the men who spoke ill of the Duchess of Arna. Another asked in surprise whether it was true that His Highness had fallen in love at first sight. Rumors and misunderstanding of what was happening only grew. The new morning began when the young wife again climbed into her favorite tree and fell asleep there. She was not used to luxurious duvets, so she was much more comfortable here. Her husband watched her from his office. He could not fall in love with his beauty, but the thoughts of why she is doing this did not leave him. His assistant Alain entered the office. He also watched how his master couldn't take his eyes off his wife and thought, maybe all this talk about love at first sight is real. Cassian suddenly returned and told the aide that he had one question. He happily said that he would help if it was within his competence. But the question of His Highness simply knocked the ground out from under Alain's feet. He asked what it could mean if the wife wanted to commit suicide on the first wedding night. Alain thought a little and said that he did not quite understand, but could it not mean that a young girl does not want to be ringed to death? And Cassian replied that surely Alain was right. The assistant felt uncomfortable after such frank conversations, so he decided to change the conversation to another topic and announced that he almost forgot something important. Alain took some official letter from his pocket and said that yesterday the second prince had asked him to give the Duke an invitation. Cassian took the letter and asked Alain if Mackenzie had given him the letter and left immediately. And Alain confirmed that this was exactly the case. Alain asked the Duke when he planned to meet the Emperor. Cassian himself began to unfold the letter because he was very interested in what was so urgent about it. After reading the contents of the letter, Cassian placed it on the table and told the assistant that this meeting would take place very soon. Arnie and his nanny had breakfast outdoors. Sipping delicious tea, the young girl decided to contact her mother with the help of a magic sphere. Or rather, it was the latter's initiative. When the image of the Duchess appeared in the sphere, she had a mysterious smile on her face. She was silent for a long time because she did not know how to ask her daughter a delicate question. Arna directly if she liked the first wedding night? This question made Arna spit out all the tea in her mouth. You can't argue with the Duchess's tact. The Duchess saw her daughter's reaction and just laughed. Then the mother added that her daughter must have liked everything. Arna herself thought that she would smash that damn sphere to hell. Then the Duchess reported that there were rumors that her subordinates were thinking of mutiny. The Knights of the Golden Order went on strike so that Lady Arna could return to her homeland. This news greatly disturbed the young girl. She thought about her knights and repeated the word, strike. The Duchess confirmed that this is exactly what is happening. The mother also added that she had lost contact with some of the knights. She wanted to notify Arna earlier, but she did not get in touch. So the Emperor also began to worry about this. An upset Arna told her mother that if she didn't get in touch, it was necessary to tell everything to Sarno. But the mother said that the daughter herself said that she had not even seen him. Arna began to make excuses that she simply had a lot to do. Although in fact she was just in a bad mood, she was ashamed to even say such a thing, so she decided to lie a little. Arna's mood was already completely spoiled. She quickly put the cup of tea on the table and began to think about the strike that her knights had arranged. The young girl already imagined the chatter of her knights, who discussed her marriage and candidates for this position. If they fell into her hands now, then surely none of them would be spared. The conversation and thoughts of the young girl were distracted by the maid, who called her mistress. Arna turned her head and looked at what exactly she was called. The maid pointed to a whole pile of boxes and said that His Highness had sent her these gifts. The mother from the field said that it was very romantic, and Arna should definitely like it. But the young girl had her own explanation for such an act. Probably he really thought that she wanted to commit suicide. But while examining the boxes with gifts, Arna's gaze stopped at the green areas. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was hiding there. When she looked more closely, she really noticed a male figure there. And besides, she was very familiar to her. A minute later, a young man came out of the bushes and smiled happily at Arna. She only had time to think what kind of old man he had forgotten here. Arna was ready to kill this idiot immediately. After all, he should now be in the Western Empire. The young girl closed her eyes and wanted it all to be just a nightmare. She specifically did not invite him to the wedding so that no one would suspect that Arna is a knight. But when the young girl opened her eyes and once again looked at the young man, it became clear that it was not a dream. Across from her stood Crave. While the maid was merrily discussing gifts for Arna with her nanny, the young girl was quickly considering how she could drive this fool out of here without anyone noticing. While the woman was busy with an interesting conversation, Arna began to pour a little more tea into the cup and quietly shouted to the young man not to be a fool, but to quickly run away from here. But the young man only laughed in response and shouted that he did not want to leave here. After these words, Arna's patience ran out, and she shouted angrily as his tongue returned to say something against Arna. She was not going to tolerate that. The young girl clearly knew that for the coordinated action of the military, first of all, discipline was necessary. Therefore, she decided to teach such a disobedient man. The young girl decided to quickly get up and throw this fool far away from here. For all her troubles, there was not enough of it here. Then Arna felt an unpleasant chill down her back. She clearly knew that someone else was present. But she decided to deal with this later, because now it was necessary to expel Crave. That young girl was so focused on her knight that she forgot she was wearing a dress. It was quite uncomfortable to move around in it, so she got caught and felt like she was going to fall. She was already preparing to meet the ground, but suddenly she felt someone's strong hand grab her. Arna looked up and met those already familiar blue eyes. Cassian deftly picked up Arna and prevented her from falling to the ground. When his wife was rescued, he asked if she had killed herself. The young girl looked at her husband and decided that she did not think that someone was watching her. But just like last time, Arna did not feel that it was him. It was then that the young girl suspected that her husband was trained to hide his presence, because there was no other explanation for it. They continued to stand like that, holding each other's hands. At that moment, she thought that if her guesses were correct, then he must already have guessed that she was a swordsman. Arnie felt that he also possessed fighting skills. At that moment, the young man thought only that his wife looked like a cat whose fur stood on end. The man decided to change the conversation and asked his wife what she was doing here. The maids understood that they were superfluous here, so they all bowed and asked permission to leave the newlyweds alone. His Highness just nodded in response. When the maids left, Cassian looked at his wife and repeated the question. She thought a little and cheerfully said that it was nothing special. Then Arnie also cheerfully asked the Duke by what winds he ended up here. She decided to keep the conversation as believable as possible so that Cassian wouldn't notice Crave. His Highness asked Arna if she liked his gifts. Arna turned to the pile of boxes that she hadn't even looked at. She was, of course, ashamed, but she decided to think about it another time. The young wife cheerfully tapped the boxes and said that she liked everything very much. Of course, she couldn't play, but she tried her best. At that moment, Arna prayed only for one thing, that he would not suspect anything. But it became clear to Cassian that the girl did not care about his gifts. At that time, Crave realized that he was definitely redundant here, so he instantly hid in the bushes. But Cassian's watchful eye had already noticed the stranger in his castle. But he was distracted by someone's voice, which cheerfully said that her beloved son-in-law had arrived, and she wanted to take a closer look at his handsome face. It was at that moment that Arna remembered that her mother was still in touch, and heard and saw everything that happened a few minutes ago. The young duke approached the magic sphere and greeted Duchess Brilt. After this greeting, the Duchess showered her son-in-law with compliments and said that her daughter was very flattered to marry such a handsome young man. Cassian was also pleasantly surprised by the compliments from his mother-in-law, and said that now he understands why Arna is so beautiful. The young girl almost fell through the ground from shame. They still exchanged compliments until Arna got tired of hearing it and asked her mother to stop this conversation. But the Duchess could not be stopped. The young girl had no choice but to exclude this damn sphere. Therefore, without thinking for a long time, she quickly approached the table and did it immediately. Arna was ashamed of her mother, so she asked her husband for forgiveness. He said that he did not worry about her, because her mother is a very nice woman. Arnie looked at her husband in disbelief. She could not fathom how the Duchess could be called a pleasant woman. Arnie had no desire to talk about his mother. Therefore, she decided to change the topic of conversation as soon as possible. She asked why he came here after all. In addition, the young girl asked if it was not working time, because it was at this time that he was supposed to spend time in his office, and she did not expect to see him here. The young man looked into his wife's eyes and asked if she was feeling better. Arnie's head immediately began to think about what exactly he had asked, but then she remembered yesterday's situation in the bedroom and thought that he must be asking about it. Cassian's gaze suddenly became so sad that something squeezed inside the young girl. He asked if marriage with him was really so unbearable for her. Arna was even frightened by these words. She could not have imagined that this misunderstanding could go so far. Cassian calmly said that he would help his wife. He only asked her to tell frankly why she decided to do such an act. Arna just mumbled in confusion that there was no need. A real volcano was raging in the young girl's head. She had no idea how to tell him about it frankly. The girl decided that it was better to fall through the ground than to explain the incident. But she only said out loud that he should not worry about yesterday and that everything was fine with her. Cassian looked at his wife with sad eyes and said that everything was clear. He said that he could see that the young lady was not ready to talk openly about it now, so he would not pressure Arna, and they would talk when she was ready. The young man turned and walked away. In Arna's head was only the thought that she would not be able to continue living like this, so the girl decided to put all the dots above and write now. Arnie caught up with her husband and took his hand. She asked to wait because she had something to tell him. Cassian looked at his wife in surprise. The young girl decided and started a story. She said that, to be as honest as possible, it was all because of their wedding night. Cassian looked at Arna and couldn't believe his ears. He did not expect to hear such an explanation. Therefore, he was waiting for what the young girl would say next. And the excited wife filled her chest with air and said that she was just scared of their wedding night. The still young wife added that she was so scared that she just wanted to run away from the bedroom. Cassian just repeated the word, escape. He couldn't even think about it. Arnie closed her eyes and waited for her husband's reaction. She didn't want to lie to him, and she didn't dare to say that their first night could have ended in his murder. His Highness repeated her words like a mantra. She wanted to run away because she was afraid of the wedding night. He could not think of such a thing. He almost laughed at this explanation. She was just scared, that's all, but he was trying to think of something that wouldn't even cross his mind. Cassian took one more look at his beauty and could not believe that he got such a sweet wife. Then the young man took his wife by the shoulder and closely approached her. His Highness gently whispered in her ear that if she didn't want it, he wouldn't lay a finger on her. Arna was so grateful to him for his understanding that for the first few minutes she did not even believe what he told her. Then she questioned whether she could really count on his patience. The young man pressed his finger to his lips and whispered that of course she could count on him, but let it remain their secret. Arna repeated that let it remain their secret. And in her mind, she remembered that lunge in the carriage when he offered to use his services. The more Arna thought about it, the more she realized that his offers were always some kind of murky ones. Therefore, she decided to learn more about him. Cassian returned to his office and began to work. A whole bunch of things were waiting for him, which accumulated in the days of his wedding. Alain also came to help His Highness. But the work did not go into the hands of His Highness. His beauty was constantly in his thoughts. He remembered how she had recently explained why she had stood on the windowsill on their wedding night. He pondered her words and came to the conclusion that Arna did not look like the kind of lady who would be frightened on her first wedding night. The Duke was watched by his assistant. He saw how His Highness was smiling something to himself and thought that at least the Duke was not moved by reason. Alain decided to call His Highness. Cassian turned his head and asked what had happened, but Alain had nothing to say to the Duke, so he explained that he simply called Cassian. Then, after several hours of work, His Highness called Alain. He quickly said that he was ready to help His Highness. Cassian put down his pen, with which he had just been signing important papers. The Duke's eyes suddenly became stern and cold. He seriously told the assistant that there was a rat in the castle, so he must find and kill it. From the very morning, there was a commotion in the castle of the Duke of Turnagain. All the maids were gathered because of the emergency that had happened since the morning. Arna's magic sphere was found broken. Therefore, the senior governess tried to find out who dared to commit such a disgrace. Everyone was very angry, because the Duke would definitely not forgive them for such a thing, and everyone understood it very well. Only the maids could not understand who was able to break this magical sphere. Arna drank her coffee and listened out of the corner of her ear to the arguments among the maids. Her mood was simply fabulous. She had never felt so satisfied in this castle. The young girl could not stand this cursed magical sphere because her mother did not give the girl peace due to excessive care and endless questioning. Therefore, while no one saw, Arna broke it. Arna heard one of the maids begin to apologize. She sharpened her hearing. Everyone knew that it was impossible for an ordinary person to break the sphere, due to the fact that it had a protective spell on it. The young duchess saw the maid, who was all in tears, and was explaining to the senior governess that she was the one who was supposed to watch over that magic sphere. The maid lowered her head and said that she should not have made eye contact with her, so she asked to forgive her for her inattention. The governess rehearsed that the maid would not pay for such a valuable thing, even if she would work as a slave for the rest of her life. She had no idea how to break it. Arnie watched as the governess screamed at the maid, and she wailed and did not know how to explain this unfortunate situation. Somewhere in the depths of her soul, the young duchess felt very sorry for the innocent maid who had to suffer the punishment for what she did not do. Therefore, she asked her nanny what was wrong with this girl. Nanny Eva explained that here, you don't even need to go to a fortune teller. For such an act, the maid will be thrown out of the castle like the last dog. Eva also added that, of course, the maid would have to pay the debt for the broken magic sphere. But an even greater punishment will be that no family will accept her into their home after this. After these words, Arna became even worse. She was already beginning to regret breaking that cursed sphere. But it was too late to confess. Therefore, the young duchess decided that if she herself was to blame in this situation, then she should also decide for herself. She got up from the table and went to the maids. As Lady Arn approached the young women, she asked what was going on. The senior governess turned her head guiltily and told the duchess not to worry. But Arna was not used to backing down. Therefore, she explained in a more stern tone that this rape is taking place in her castle, so she has every right to know what happened here. These words made the senior governess sick. She did not expect that the young girl would get used to the new place so quickly and would call it her castle. This should have been reported immediately. Arnie said loudly that she knew the magic sphere was broken because the maids had made such a mess that only a deaf person would not have heard what was going on. The young duchess walked over to the broken magic sphere and asked in surprise why create such chaos over this stupid thing. Arnie then added that it wasn't such a big problem, so all the maids should forget about this unfortunate incident and go about their daily business. The maid stopped crying. She looked at her savior with eyes full of surprise and hope for rescue. The crying maid did not even expect that someone would stand up for her. All servants also lost the gift of speech. They opened their mouths and only blinked their eyes. No one knew how to react to such a request from their new duchess. Arn felt how all the present maids, including her nanny Eva, were staring at her. The confused senior governess carefully asked the young duchess if she was sure of her decision, that they could let this incident go unpunished. Arnie smiled and told everyone loudly that they are all human and have the right to make mistakes. Finally, the young duchess added that they would buy a new sphere, and that would be the end of the matter. The young duchess loudly announced that the circus was over and everyone should return to their duties. The young duchess was approached by a bewildered servant who, a few minutes ago, wanted to be severely punished for the broken sphere. The maid burst into tears and vowed that she would be faithful to the young duchess until her last days. The young girl could not even hope for such an ending to this story. The maid knelt before Arna and said that she was a true savior. The servant herself swore to be grateful for her mercy until her death. The maid also added that she will work hard and will not regret risking her life for the sake of the young duchess. Arna was uncomfortable with all this, so she told the maid to calm down. Arna tried to calm the crying Erica. A nanny approached the girls and showed a box. The surprised girls looked at each other and looked at Eva again. The nanny explained that she had suspected that this might happen, so she had taken care of it in advance and bought many spheres. She opened the chest and the face of a contented duchess appeared from the magical sphere. Without wasting a moment, the senior governess quickly ran to the duke's office and immediately reported what had recently happened in his castle. Surprised, Alain just opened his eyes. His Highness himself listened attentively to the maid's detailed report, only smiled with satisfaction, and thought that he did not expect that his wife would be interested in fights among the maids. The senior governess and the assistant did not have time to chat when they noticed that His Highness suddenly got up from his chair and was about to go somewhere. They both looked at each other in surprise, and she asked Cassian where he had gone. His Highness turned his head and calmly said that he would go to his wife. The confused senior governess and the Duke's assistant only saw the door close and they were left alone. Alain thought that His Highness had never been so distracted from his work before. Every day, the host's behavior bothered Alain more and more. Erica still couldn't stop thanking her savior, so she looked for Arnie all over the garden. The young duchess hid behind a tree and waited for the maid to leave. While Arna was waiting for the maid to unhook herself from her, she thought about what kind of old man she constantly finds herself in such situations. She had already begun to wonder what might be the matter in her mood. As Arna waited behind the tree, she felt someone approach her. The feeling had never failed the young girl, so she quickly turned her head and could not believe her own eyes. Crave appeared before the young duchess, but only dressed he was quite strange. Arna was even contacted by his unexpected appearance. The young girl could no longer restrain her emotions, so she loudly shouted what kind of fool he was doing here, and also dressed like the last fool. Crave stood in front of Arna, dressed in a beautiful green dress, with precious earrings in his ears, and a woman's hairstyle neatly arranged on his head. If you don't look closely, it was a real beauty. Crave's eyes sparkled with satisfaction after the young duchess's question. He smiled and announced that he was dressed in a simply perfect disguise. Confused, Arna only silently examined her knight from head to toe. It was difficult to argue with his words. The disguise was a piece of cake. Arnie asked Crave if he got a job here as a maid, and he shook his head with satisfaction. Arnie closed her eyes and thought that she would just kill him right now. The young girl worriedly asked if anyone had noticed him, and he said, offended, that this simply cannot happen, because he is a master of disguise and penetration. Arnie asked what kind of old man he was doing here, because his duty was to be in the Western Empire. And Crave explained that he had written a resignation letter and arrived at this castle. Arnie angrily asked why he did that, and Crave explained that his duty was next to his commander. Arna rolled her eyes under her forehead and was once again convinced of his senseless act. She had no choice but to turn back and silently walk to the building. Crave yelled at the young girl's back that he had no choice but to swear allegiance to His Highness because it was his duty, but the only person he would follow was Arna. Arna only silently listened to Crave's explanation and defiantly ignored him. He continued that he will always remember the battle where Arna saved his life. Then Crave could no longer contain his emotions and shouted that his loyalty was stronger than death. He asked what kind of marriage it was, where the man now came first for Arna. The young man shouted that he could see that the young girl was trying to be weak and vulnerable for her current status, and he wanted his beloved commander back. But Arna didn't even think to answer the angry Crave. She demonstratively continued to ignore the knight and was already waiting for him to get away. An enraged Crave approached Arna and shouted in her face what to do with the oath she gave to her knights to always be by their side. But the angry Arnie only squealed through her teeth so that he would get away. Uncle Sarno would be coming back soon, so Crave had to go with him and not be a fool here. But the knight could not stop. He took hold of his commander's hand and asked permission to stay here with him as a servant, because he was a good worker. Arna told him not to talk nonsense. When they were emotionally communicating, they did not hear the sound of footsteps approaching them from the door. When they turned their heads, they saw Duke Cassian approaching them. Confused Arna and frightened Crave just blinked her eyes. His Highness asked his wife what was happening here. When Cassian noticed that his wife hesitated with the answer, he decided to repeat his question, but in a colder tone. He wondered what his wife was doing alone in such a place. The young girl was completely lost. She started to explain and stopped because she didn't know what to come up with. All she could think about was what kind of old man her husband had appeared at such an inopportune moment. Then she also realized that her knight Crave was nearby, dressed in a woman's outfit, and Arna almost lost consciousness from that. Drops of cold sweat appeared on the young girl's forehead. Life never taught her to lie, especially so unexpectedly. But it was necessary to save the skin of this fool. Therefore, Arn smiled widely and decided to introduce this maid to his Highness. She started stuttering again, and Cassian said that this was the maid his wife was seeing for the first time in her life. Arnie smiled and breathed a sigh of relief, agreeing with Cassian's explanation. But then it dawned on her that he himself came up with an explanation for this awkward situation for her. Cassian explained that he didn't think she was serving in their castle as he had never seen her before. And Arna suggested in her voice that perhaps she had come with her from the Western Empire. Cassian smiled and said that now everything was clear. Arna did not believe his words and once again looked at Crave. She began to wonder if he really looked like a woman. Crave decided to do his legs before it got too hot, so he politely bowed and asked permission to leave. Both Duke and Arna nodded their heads quickly, trying to get this over with as quickly as possible. So, without thinking long, he decided to quickly turn aside and go away. As soon as he went out the door and closed it behind him, it was as if a burden fell from his shoulders. He had never felt such relief. The young man wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. When Crave took a breather, a satisfied smile appeared on his face. He thought that Arna's husband had not noticed anything, so there was no need to panic. But then Crave remembered how coldly his Highness had looked at the knight at first. After carefully analyzing the appearance of the Duke at the beginning and at the end of their meeting, the knight came to the conclusion that he had misunderstood something. Arnie also noticed how her husband's gaze had changed. Therefore, she suspected that everything was going smoothly with her knight's disguise. The young girl decided not to put their conversation in a long box and was the first to ask why her husband was so angry. His Highness asked why she asked that, and the young wife explained that she thought he was angry. Then His Highness suddenly asked if his wife had a secret conversation with the maid. Arna nodded her head and said that nothing like that happened. Cassian smiled and said that it was very good and that he believed his wife. She breathed a sigh of relief and thought that the conversation about that maid would end there. But His Highness asked Arna if the maid didn't seem rather strange to her. After all, she had as many muscles on her back as not every pumped-up man has. Arnie began to worry again, but mumbled that she hadn't noticed anything like that. Cassian added that it was not polite to question a person's gender based on appearance alone. The young girl agreed with this statement of the Duke. She wondered to herself whether the disguise had been successful, or whether the man's words should not be trusted after all. Cassian remained silent and watched carefully for the reaction of his wife, who was going through the various options for ending today's incident in her head. His Highness then said that he constantly thought that when his wife began to enter into her thoughts, her eyes were extremely beautiful. Arna raised her eyes and looked at the man. Arna was surprised to ask Cassian if he was speaking frankly, because many of her acquaintances said that her gaze was similar to that of a murderer. His Highness smiled and said that he has absolutely no point in telling the truth, and he really thinks so. The cruel red-eyed killer, the executioner of Levelgos. These are the nicknames Arna heard from his very birth. She was always treated like a cursed monster with blood-red eyes. Since childhood, people were afraid to look into her eyes. Everyone said that it was a family curse, and that only one person in the entire generation is born with such a defect. Arnie also said that her uncle and grandfather were red-eyed swordsmen. Cassian asked if her uncle was the same famous hero. His Highness had heard that the red-eyed swordmaster had caught the monstrous dragon that had awakened 30 years ago and ended the war with the Eastern Alliance 10 years ago. Arnie said that was exactly the case. Although she thought to herself that her uncle actually got the nickname Dragon Slayer, Arna herself ended the war with the Eastern Alliance. Arnie began to talk about her uncle and praised him as much as she could, saying what a good person he was. But she was so engrossed in the story that she did not notice how the Duke began to smile. Arna stopped the story and asked what happened, addressing him as the Duke. His Highness told his wife not to call him Duke. And when Arna asked what exactly she should call her husband, he answered, "Dear." A blush appeared on the young girl's cheeks. She thought, what a dear uncle. She had never called anyone that in her life. It was hard for her to say that. His Highness noticed how his wife was embarrassed and decided not to put more pressure on her. He addressed her by name and said that from now on, that is what he would call her. And then he asked that his wife also call him by his name. Arna lowered her head and did not dare to say his name. But there was nothing to do. I came to accept the terms of his agreement. By name, yes, by name. She spoke the first syllable of his name first, then added the second. Finally, the young girl said his name. His Highness approached her and stroked her head. He was glad that she fulfilled his request, as it was not difficult for her. So he smiled with satisfaction and said that she is smart. After such a tense conversation, His Highness decided not to torment his wife anymore and went to the office to continue his work, which he had been busy with in recent days. On the way, Cassian remembered his wife's reaction when he caught her with that maid and decided he wasn't that dangerous. Therefore, Cassian decided to catch him and interrogate him thoroughly. With these thoughts, His Highness walked down the long corridors of his majestic castle. Arna also decided to dot all the dots and ordered to find a new maid. Crave immediately ran to Arna and cheerfully said that at last the commander had called him. The young girl clearly knew that Crave had been walking around the castle in this outfit for 2 days, and it was very surprising that no one suspected anything. Arna wondered if she was the only one who found this situation strange, or if anyone else had begun to guess the true gender of this new maid. Arnie seriously turned to Crave, and when he began to listen to her attentively, she told her knight to explain what had happened. Crave said that as soon as Arna announced her wedding and went here, the Knights of the Golden Order began to rebel, because they were all always inseparable from their commander. He continued that they all joined that order just to be close to the commander, and he suddenly disappears. Therefore, the Knights had no other way out. Crave said that he was the first to resign. The young girl carefully listened to his story and thought that she still believed in their adequacy before that. Arna was punishing herself for not telling her knights that this marriage was only for 3 months. And then it would be possible to avoid these stupid misunderstandings. Crave also added that he met Ergen when he was also writing a resignation letter, so it can be concluded that he is also going to leave. Arnie asked her knight not to talk about all these dismissals so nonchalantly. Crave thought and fell silent for a while. But then he happened to notice an open door. A maid was peering into the room through the crack, and it was not known how long she had been listening to their conversation. The maid and Crave met eyes, and she knew she had been noticed. Erica was no joke, but it was too late to retreat. Arnie also noticed that maid and her first thought was when exactly she had appeared there, and how clearly she had heard their conversation. Of course, she didn't have enough of that here for all the problems. But the knight decided to defuse this situation on his own and told his commander that it looks like this maid is annoying Arnie enough, so he will deal with her now. The young Duchess only had time to shout what he was going to do, because her first thought was that Crave would beat her now. But he did not pay attention to Arnie's words and walked towards the door. When the disgruntled Crave's face appeared in the doorway, Erica backed away from fear. This new maid, in her opinion, was quite huge and scary. Crave exclaimed that her ladyship had already accepted him as her new handmaiden, so the oath of allegiance to Erica would have to be taken sometime in the future life. The maid tensed up and tears ran down her face with her hands. They rolled either out of resentment or out of fear. She herself did not understand. But then the maid couldn't stand it and quickly ran away down the corridor. On the way, she cried loudly and protested that Her Highness could not have done such a cruel thing to her. Crave, when he made sure that the annoying maid disappeared from the field of view, loudly slammed the door and went to Arna. When he approached his commander, he cheerfully asked how she liked or disliked his act when he so skillfully beat up that maid. He was very pleased with himself. Arna just rolled her eyes under her forehead and once again made sure that it would be better for everyone when she sent Crave with Uncle Sarno back to the Western Empire. Arn was having breakfast in the fresh air one fine morning. She liked to spend her free time in nature because that's how she felt free, just like in her former unmarried life. Crave was nearby, trying to please his commander by pouring tea into her cup. She looked at him displeased and asked him to get out of here because Arna wanted to be alone. But Crave did not think of leaving the young duchess. He cheerfully told her that soon she would go to the capital and she would need a maid like Crave by her side. After all married aristocrats had to go through one mandatory procedure, namely the approval of their marriage by the emperor himself. This was a way of settling family disputes, if such arose in the new family, and also the announcement of the emperor's inheritance rights to the property of aristocrats. Arna put the cup on the table. She understood that visiting the capital was, to put it simply, a formal introduction to a higher authority. As the young girl began to consider her upcoming trip to the capital, she was distracted by voices. Arna turned her head and saw a crowd of maids waiting nearby. From the expressions on their faces, it was clear to the naked eye that they were in a serious mood. Martha was the main one in the center, and this caused even more anxiety in Arna. Martha said that they had a conversation and asked to pay attention to them. Arna immediately thought that she must have guessed that her new maid is a man. Arna was even surprised that all this time no one guessed that he was a man. But that time came, when the problem came out. Marta looked at her with such a look that she was ready to kill the new maid, and that sent a chill down even Arna's spine. Martha and Crave looked each other straight in the eye, and Arna decided to defuse the situation somehow. The girl stood between them and decided to explain everything herself. But before Arna had time to begin her explanation, the maids in advance began to express their complaints about the fact that Arna had gotten too close to the new maid. Crave himself did not expect such claims, but the maids asked Arna why she always chooses a new maid, and if it is because she comes from the Western Empire, then they will go there too. The maids wanted Arna to give them a chance too. Marta explained that everyone was offended that Arna only paid attention to one maid, and they also wanted to be useful to Her Highness. A mountain simply fell off Arnie's shoulders. She had already thought that there would be a showdown over the gender of the new maid, but they only took offense at the fact that she was spending a lot of time with her. Arnie explained to everyone that this is not about any advantages. In fact, she assured that she liked all the maids without exception. After these words, the maids' eyes shone happily. The maids began to question whether this was really true, because they also liked their mistress very much. Arna was pleased that even this misunderstanding could be corrected so easily. A few days after that incident, all the maids gathered in the yard to escort Arna to the capital. The carriage was already waiting for the young duchess. Cassian approached Arna, who would also take his wife on a long journey. He said that she is only coming to meet the emperor, so there is no need to worry. Then His Highness gently took Arna's hand. Her heart began to beat faster. Cassian gently touched her hand with his hot lips. The warmth from his kiss spread throughout the young girl's body. Arnie stood and did not dare to move. Her cheeks glowed red. Cassian said they wouldn't see each other for a while. His Highness explained that due to the pile of urgent matters that had accumulated recently, he would have to stay here for a while, and in a few days he would join his wife. Arna said that she would then go first because of her uncle. Cassian just smiled and added that he would join her soon. Then he touched his hand to her face. She understood that something was going to happen now, and she was not mistaken. His Highness bent over her and kissed her tenderly. She looked at him fascinated. When his lips touched hers, his heart stopped for a few minutes. As soon as their eyes met after a gentle kiss, Cassian said that if she missed him so much, let this kiss help her. The maids kept their eyes on their masters. So liked all these romantic relationships, so the maids were very happy when they managed to witness these kisses. Arn could not regain consciousness for several minutes after the kiss, and only the nanny's voice made the girl pull herself together and get into the carriage. Crave finally took off his dress and mounted the horse to join the crew. He greeted Uncle Sarno. He smiled back and said that finally they would go together. In the carriage, Nanny and Arna were discussing Knight Crave. Nanny asked if he was really that loyal, and Arna said that thanks to his character, he rose to the rank of deputy commander. Arna looked out the carriage window and thought that she was traveling in a carriage for the first time in her life. Before that, she was constantly riding a horse. The young girl looked at the scenery and noted that it was not so bad, because it was possible not to focus on driving the horse, but to enjoy the scenery in peace. But as soon as Arna sank into her thoughts, she immediately remembered their last kiss with her husband. When she caught herself thinking what was on her mind, a blush immediately appeared on her cheeks. Only this was not enough, because the girl understood that she was not alone in the carriage. Arna caught the maid's eyes on her and closed her eyes. She ordered herself to immediately stop thinking about such nonsense, and wondered how she had come to this in the first place. The young duchess reassured herself by the fact that she was simply not used to driving in comfort, which is why all kinds of nonsense came to her head. Then the carriage began to shake strangely. Excited voices were heard, and Arna understood that the attack on the crew had begun. Hundreds of arrows flew at the accompanying crew. No one expected such insolence in broad daylight, so it was a surprise to everyone. Crave immediately decided to get everyone in battle formation, so he began to order the guards to cover the Duke and Lady and protect the carriage. Duke Sarno was not in combat behind the scenes, so he crouched behind the carriage and tried to hide on the shields of the guards. But dodging the arrows became more and more difficult. Crave saw how confused everyone was, so he tried to gather all the warriors into a pile. He gave orders, and everyone stood up for protection. He had no idea that this would happen immediately after his arrival here. At this time in the castle of the Duke of Ternugensky, Cassian was playing chess in his study. Assistant Alan also stood nearby and watched His Highness. Looking at the chessboard, Cassian thought before making his next move. He took the horse in his hands and thought for a long time about what move to make. His confusion was noticed by the assistant. Therefore, without thinking long, he asked Cassian what was the matter. His Highness explained that he was unlucky today. His Highness continued to hold the horse in his hands and decided whether to beat the knight with it or to go the other way. Cassian already knew that such layouts on the chessboard did not happen by chance. Therefore, His Highness did not jokingly think about what this could mean. His deep thoughts were interrupted by a servant who flew into the Duke's study without knocking and loudly rehearsed that he had urgent news for His Highness. The servant shouted that the Duke's wife had been defiantly attacked. Cassian's heart beat faster. Now this arrangement on the chessboard became clear. Arna smelled an unpleasant smell in the carriage. She cleared her throat and determined that the attackers had used a smoke grenade. It became clear that they were attacked by professional robbers. The nanny who accompanied the young duchess had already lost consciousness from the caustic smoke. Erica still held on and repeated that she would protect Her Highness no matter what it cost her. Arna looked into her maid's eyes and apologized. Of course, she didn't want to do it, but the prospect of the maid witnessing her fights was even less appealing. Therefore, Arna skillfully cut down her servant with one left hand and, making sure that she was unconscious, got out of the carriage. As soon as the door of the carriage opened, she was immediately noticed by the guard who had been posted here to guard Lady Arnie. He shouted that it was strictly forbidden for her to get out of the carriage. Well, Arnie didn't think long and hit him too. The guard fell near the carriage. The young girl is not used to someone giving her orders, so let this guy think about his behavior. The time has come to deal with these brats who dared to attack the Duke's carriage. Arna took out her magic weapon. It's time for her to help the master do his job. A magical sword appeared in the right hand of the warrior Arna. He had never let his mistress down, so this time he hoped to serve her with faith and truth. With one wave of his, several attackers got into hell. Arna knew well how to practice with the sword. Never more. Cassian flew on horseback to save his wife. Alain galloped after him. The aide saw how His Highness spared neither himself nor his horse. He roared for the Duke to be more careful. But before the Duke's eyes were not complicated gorges and narrow paths, but the face of his wife. All the way, he thought about Arnie and hoped that nothing bad had happened to her. Cassian caught himself in thought and tried to understand why he was thinking about Arna all the time. It was like he was losing a valuable chess piece. Arna was skillfully sending attackers to hell was one of the two swords of the Luelgos clan. And this particular sword was called Nevermore. Crave knew very well that this sword devoured souls, so the attackers had no chance. Especially since this sword was skillfully wielded by his most beloved commander, Arna. Not a single muscle moved on Arna's face. She knew very well what she was doing and how many opponents were still alive. Therefore, without being distracted by unnecessary movements, she killed them one by one. Another attacker has already gone to the forefathers. Arna realized that there was not much left. Crave only watched from the side, as with every second the number of enemies became fewer and fewer. He only thought that his best commander suddenly changed the whole situation. But another attacker repelled Arna. Her sword stopped for a moment and bounced back. Arna wondered for a second who it could be so strong that it was not the first time that she managed to kill him. The man who managed to stop the onslaught of Arna was also not jokingly afraid of this militant woman, who in a few minutes dealt with his entire squad of thugs. The attacker decided to escape from here as soon as possible while he was still alive. But Arna had other plans for him. She knew that leaving witnesses alive was the last mistake, so she quickly finished him off. Bloodied Arn surveyed the battlefield. Of course, she had to deal with a larger number of enemies, but today, too, there were quite a few of them lying around. The sword could also talk, but only Arna could hear it. Sword asked her why she summoned him only now, and how could he be exploited so harshly after such a long hiatus. But the young girl was not in the mood for small talk. She told him to close the bag and go back. The sword tried to say something else, but it was too late. Crave approached Arna and said that it was necessary to leave at least someone alive, so that they could interrogate him and find out who sent them and what they needed. The young girl replied that if they did not finish the matter to the end, then they would certainly appear again on their way, then they would do it. Before the young people had time to catch their breath, armed guards appeared and began to ask the Duchess about her well-being. It was clear from their appearance that they were driving here without stopping at full speed. The guards began to speculate that it looked like an attempt had been made to abduct the young Duchess if she was not currently in a carriage. Confused, Arna collected her thoughts, but before Arna had time to think of what to answer to these questions of the guards, she heard a familiar voice from behind, who also asked about her well-being. The young girl turned and saw a worried Cassian, who had dismounted from his horse. You could tell by his appearance that he was worried and scared at the same time. Arna did not expect to see anyone but her husband here. Of course, she was pleased that he left everything and rushed here to save his wife. The young girl came closer to her husband and noticed the gloomy expression on his face. Cassian was so happy to see that everything was fine with his beauty that he did not hold back his emotions and hugged Arna tightly. He pressed her to him like the most valuable treasure. Only when she was in his arms, His Highness calmed down. The smell of her hair restored his faith that everything was fine and that his wife was fine. The Duke informed his wife that he had taken care of this in advance and had the crew under surveillance. Then he asked if Arna was injured. She was surprised and scared at the same time. Arna did not expect that he was so prescient that he took care of tracking. She decided that she should be more careful in the future. Cassian touched her bloodied cheek and said it was good that she was feeling well after such a bloody slaughter. When His Highness made sure that his wife had not suffered any injuries, he took a closer look at the battlefield. What he saw could not but cause admiration. Dozens of dead attackers were lying around, and the one who so skillfully sent them to the other world must have possessed remarkable military skills. Therefore, he asked his wife who did all this. She was immediately confused, because the girl could not confess to Cassian that she had done everything. In the head of the confused girl, thoughts swirled again, desperately searching for an explanation. But thank God, the voice of her Uncle Sarno was heard, who said that he would explain everything now. Uncle Sarno was wounded, so he leaned on Crave's shoulder. When he came closer, he said that the rescue of Arna, who was tried to be kidnapped, and the destruction of the enemy was the work of Sir Crave. Crave nearly fainted at that statement. Drops of sweat appeared on the forehead. Of course, he did not expect such a reason. Arnie was so glad that her uncle had found a way out of this situation that she picked up the idea and began to tell His Highness that Crave had done everything. Cassian looked at the young man in disbelief and asked if he could really handle so many attackers alone. Something like this story caused little confidence in the Duke. Crave himself was shocked by the number of bandits killed. He scanned the battlefield once more with an appraising look. Creed needed to answer something, so at first he decided not to lie so much and tell at least a little truth. The young man thought and opened his mouth to tell how everything happened. But then his gaze met Arna's gaze, and her red eyes burned Crave so much that it was obvious that if he did not confirm Uncle Sarno's version, she would kill him right now. So the young man had no choice but to confess that it was all his doing. He also vividly described how exactly he dealt with all the scoundrels. In the capital, everyone was also discussing the marriage of the Duke of Ternugensky. The worldly Beaumont was interested in the story of Cassian's acquaintance, because no one believed that they fell in love at first sight. No one believed that his lordship would choose a princess from the Western Empire as his wife. Everyone was also interested in the story of Lady Haley. After all, it will help that the Duke is already married. And the unfortunate Lady Haley was left with a broken trough, no matter what, although she was considered the future wife of Duke Cassian. But there was an even bigger question that interested almost every inhabitant of the Northern Empire. How will the Emperor himself react to Cassian's marriage? The crew of the Duke of Ternugensky has already reached the Emperor's palace. A large crowd of servants lined up on the steps, who were happy to welcome the arriving guests. Cassian decided to travel the rest of the way with his wife because he was worried about her safety. As soon as Arne got out of the carriage, she was simply delighted with the Count's huge estate. Arne did not have time to take a good look at the estate when a man approached them and greeted His Highness and his wife. The man bowed, and Cassian answered him that they had not seen each other for a long time. Arne did not understand who this man was, so she patiently waited for him to be introduced to her. Finally, the man explained to the young girl that he was the senior butler in this estate and offered Arne, if she did not mind, to conduct a tour here. Arne agreed, because it was necessary to do something in this new place. Therefore, getting acquainted with its structure would be exactly what is needed. Meanwhile, in the imperial palace of the Northern Empire, Uncle Sarno was sitting on the couch of the adopted emperor and waiting for an audience. Until he was invited to a meeting, he had time to think about everything. Sarno remembered his conversation a few hours ago after that bloody battle. Then he spoke to Duke Cassian and told him that the attackers were not like ordinary robbers. But the Duke was thinking about his own. Then Sarno asked if His Highness was all right, and Cassian came back from his thoughts and assured Uncle Sarno that he was all right. Duke Cassian then told Sarno that he had already guessed whose hands it was, and it was clear from the look on the man's face that he didn't like the answer he found. Uncle Sarno decided to somehow warn the Duke not to make ill-considered decisions, let alone actions, because there was no evidence of his guesses in them. And then Cassian assured Sarno not to worry, because Arne was too dear to him, so he wouldn't make a fuss. After those words, Sarno kept wondering if he had done the right thing in sending Arne to this man. These doubts haunted Sarno every day. In recent days, Sarno has already begun to think about the fact that this is all someone's big game, and Arne will be the victim in it. It was he who insisted on this union, so the feeling of guilt will always be with him. But then he remembered Arne herself, and all her military achievements. A smile appeared on his face, and Sarno caught himself thinking, who is he worried about at all? After all, if something goes wrong, then his girl will simply kill them all and return home. He decided to just hope that she would persevere in this married life. All these thoughts were running through Uncle Sarno's head while he was waiting in the reception room. But very soon the servant interrupted Sarno's thoughts and informed him that the emperor accepted his request for an audience and was waiting for him. Sarno was very happy to finally talk to the emperor. He said that he did not expect such a quick meeting, and to be honest, he was worried that he would not be driven away from here. Of course, Sarno was not good at jokes, but he still tried to joke whenever he had the chance. He waved his finger and ordered his guards to bring something here. A minute later, a pile of all kinds of boxes appeared in front of the surprised servant. He asked in surprise what it was, and Sarno explained that he could not visit the emperor of the northern lands without gifts. About himself, Sarno thought that, in other words, it was a bribe so that they would treat Arne better, and at the same time to warn that if something happened to her, Sarno would not stay away. Arne wandered after the butler, who told them about the castle. When she got to the next room, he said that it belonged to the late Duchess, and at the moment it was closed, and entry there was forbidden. The butler also added that this room was intended for use by the Duke's wife, but due to certain recent circumstances, Arne's room would be here. The man also added that all the jewelry was specially made to order, and they have a very rich history. He then said that this was a brief history of this estate. The butler said that if Lady Arna was interested in anything else, he would be happy to tell her everything in detail. She just wanted to shout that she was tired of this boring story. That lady had to answer politely, so she said in a calm tone that it can be assumed that she is familiar with the history of the estate in detail, and he can be free. As soon as the butler left and the door to the room closed, Arna's first thing was to fall on the bed and exhale. She said she was finally left alone and could rest in peace. But suddenly someone knocked on the door. Annoyed, Arn got up from the bed again and was already cursing in her mind because she wouldn't be allowed to rest. She shouted for them to come in. Crave's satisfied physiognomy appeared in the doorway. He smiled cheerfully and greeted his commander. Arnie irritably asked what he was leaning on, and he cheerfully said that he came to be close to his commander. Arnie asked why he didn't change into a maid if he wanted to be around, and Crave jokingly asked if she missed his attractive appearance in the role of a maid. When Arna seriously replied that she wasn't sad, Crave continued to joke, saying that Arna might not be pretending and telling the whole truth. Crave then said in a more serious tone that he had something concerning her husband. Interest appeared on Arna's face. It already promised to be more intriguing. Crave began to tell that her husband is quite a nice and kind person, so the question arises that he did not have enough, that he decided to marry Arna. The young girl said that Crave was lying because she knew it very well. But their dialogue was abruptly interrupted by a loud knock on the door. Both young people shuddered. Arnie politely asked who was knocking on the door. A rather familiar and pleasant voice answered her that he had come. It was clear even to a fool that her husband Cassian was waiting for her outside the door. This is the continuation of today. Frightened, Arna and Crave looked at each other and wondered what they should do now. Arnie's room, and waiting for permission to enter for a long time, asked again if he could come into her room. Crave immediately offered to hide so Cassian wouldn't see him. But Arnie categorically nodded her head because she did not want to immerse herself in lies even more. She said emphatically that the man was coming in. When Cassian crossed the threshold of the room, he was pleasantly surprised that his wife was not alone in the room. So, next to his wife stood Crave, the same man who, according to eyewitnesses, sent a whole squad of hired killers to the other world on his own. Lady Arn calmly explained to her husband that Uncle Sarn wanted to tell her something personal, so he sent the knight to deliver the message. Cassian smiled and pretended to be fine. Then, Arna herself asked His Highness what brought him to her at such a late hour. Crave, on the other hand, was simply shocked by the fact that Arna did not blink an eye as she chatted with Cassian. His Highness said that he wanted to tell his wife about tomorrow's schedule, and also, he missed her. Some crazy lights appeared in his eyes. After his last sentence, a blush appeared on her cheeks again. She was confused as to how he could say such personal things in front of strangers. A nanny appeared at the door of the room. She said that she had prepared a bathtub for bathing, so she came to pick up Arna. Then she asked if she had disturbed them during an important conversation. And Arnie, taking advantage of such a wonderful opportunity, decided to leave the room and these men, from whom she so wanted to rest. Arna said Eva came just in time. Arn quickly apologized to the men and said she had to go so the water wouldn't get cold. She quickly hurried out of the room. Crave also decided to take advantage of this situation, so he bowed and said that it was also time for him to do his business, so he had to go. But he did not have time to take the first step towards the door when His Highness asked him to wait. Cassian went to the door first and quietly closed it. Crave didn't like it anymore because it was only clear that a frank conversation was waiting for him. His Highness, closing the door, asked the knight to give him a little attention. A chill ran down Crave's spine. Immediately the thought flashed through Crave's mind that His Highness had betrayed him, but he decided to just smile because that was how Crave used to mask his true emotions. From the expression on His Highness's face, it seemed that he was not in the mood for jokes, and Crave realized that such tricks would not go down well with Cassian. Then Crave decided to get down to business right away. He asked the Duke what exactly he wanted to talk to him about. Crave clearly understood that if he was exposed, there would be problems in Arna as well. Cassian said he had some important questions for Crave, and the first of these questions will be who Crave really is. This question, of course, immediately knocked the ground out from under Crave's feet. He thought that the story of him taking down all the attackers by himself was too fantastic. Crave had yet to think of an answer, as Cassian himself said that he had a guess as to who Crave really was. The man just smiled back. His Highness said that he was interested in only two things: his true personality, and most importantly, his relationship with Arna. It was clear from Cassian's cold look that he was not going to joke. Crave bowed his head and thought. How to explain to him his relationship with the commander? These relations were not completely clear to him either. Therefore, without thinking for a long time, Crave said that he and Arnsh are close, but this relationship is difficult to explain. He didn't want to deceive His Highness, so he apologized for not telling him earlier. Crave also added that he came here because he was very worried about her when he was at a great distance from Arna. When their eyes met, Crave felt sick from Cassian's cold gaze. At first, he thought that after such a frank explanation, he only confirmed some kind of relationship. Crave immediately decided to somehow explain his words and began to come up with something again, but His Highness only interrupted him and directly asked if the swordmaster was Crave. The shocked knight was speechless for several minutes. What? He definitely did not expect to hear such a question. When he regained consciousness, he asked how such nonsense could come to His Highness's head at all, and His Highness calmly explained that no matter how much he thought about the question of who could have the power to repel so many attackers at once, no one but the master of the sword came to mind. Cassian added that this was why Crave had gone secretly after his niece, out of concern for her safety. Cassian then added that he was glad to see him in the Northern Empire. Crave immediately realized that His Highness had taken him for Arnie's own uncle, Mr. Grahan. But the shrewd knight decided to play along with Cassian, so he smiled and extended his hand in greeting. His Highness added that Crave he made himself at home here and said that he would no longer detain the knight and distract him with his chatter. Crave could not regain consciousness for a long time after Cassian's departure. Of course, he was very pleased that he was confused, but there was one question. Could he now hope for a peaceful life? Crave immediately went to his commander to tell about the private conversation with her husband. She listened with her mouth open. Arna had no idea that things would turn out like this. Towards the end of the conversation, she asked if he really pretended to be her uncle, and Crave confirmed that everything was indeed so. Arne thought about it and said that now was the right time for Crave to disappear from their lives for a long time, but he did not want to hear that he would not see his commander again. Arne then said that if you think about it, Crave really does look like her uncle. A satisfied smile spread across Crave's face, and he asked what exactly he looked like. But Arne told him not to pester him with such stupid questions, because he is already causing problems. At least take it easy. Arne tried with all her might to come up with a way out of this difficult situation. And Crave sat next to him and waited for the commander to come up with something, because she always managed to do it. Arne said that the uncle had a sword that was more famous than the uncle himself. It was the Levitoon dragon sword, and there was only one sword that could replace the dragon's majesty. Therefore, Arne immediately summoned the sword Evermore to appear immediately. A second later, Arne took out a sword beautifully decorated with precious stones from the magical vortex. The sword obediently fell into the hand of its owner. Crave just opened his mouth at what he saw. It was so fascinating that even though he had seen it before, every time he was amazed at how small the child was. This sword was the complete opposite of the Nevermore sword. The Evermore sword. Ven was born from the light and led the lost soul and the warrior to the Hall of Valor and Glory. It was a sacred sword. Arne let go of her sword. Crave noted about himself that with a sword in her hands, his commander looked even more attractive. The sword began to speak and immediately asked its owner why she did not summon him for so long, whether it was possible because her feelings for him had faded. Also, the sword Evermore added that she promised to value it when they signed the cooperation contract. But Arne asked her sword if he could do something for Arna, because no one could handle it except him. Mech really liked being praised, so he immediately changed his tone and said that she finally recognized his superiority. Then he inquired about the special case. Arna was waiting for his approval, so she pointed her finger at Crave, who was waiting nearby all the time. The young girl asked the man to keep the sword for a while, but that wasn't all. Arna also added that Evermore needed to pretend to be a Levitoon sword. When he heard the sword, he was only able to wonder if Arna was joking. Evermore's sword did not like Arna's request. He questioned her if she really wanted him to pretend with this worthless sword. He did not want to believe in this dissimilarity. Then the sword turned to the man and threateningly told him that when he touched his precious body. But before he could finish the sword, Crave assured him that he would be careful with it. Crave also assured that every morning and evening he would personally carefully check the condition of his shiny blade, and if necessary, immediately polish it to a shine. Mecha was already beginning to like this attitude, and he asked Arna if the man was lying. And Lady Arna assured him that Crave was very careful with his weapons. The agreement was concluded. The Sword of Evermore agreed to the terms and threatened that if Crave did not fulfill his promise to polish it to a shine, it would immediately return to its former form. Crave thanked Evermore for his trust, and the sword asked to be called Levitine now. Arna was glad that she had managed to solve this problem and thanked Evermore for his understanding. The next day, Lady Arna wore a very beautiful blue dress. On the way, she caught herself thinking that she was already used to dresses, and even she was starting to like them. Her husband was already waiting for her. An important event awaited them today, a meeting with the Emperor. He smiled and once again made sure that his wife was a real beauty. Then he suddenly took her by the waist and pulled her as close as possible to him. He missed such touches, especially last night. Crave prevented him from retiring. When their eyes met, Arnu already looked into his eyes, and Cassian noticed that she wasn't afraid to look at him now. She caught herself thinking that her heart began to beat wildly. Arnie wasn't comfortable looking at His Highness, so she quickly looked away and said that they should hurry so they wouldn't be late on the first day. When the carriage stopped in front of the Emperor's estate, Arna noticed that the palace was much larger and richer in appearance than the palace of the Western Empire. Even the entrance to the palace was decorated with exquisite sculptures. Even Arna looked at them as she passed them, although she knew nothing about art. A young girl walked through such exquisite architecture with her mouth open. Her husband walked alongside and kept his eyes on his beauty. He even liked her reaction. Cassian then heard the voice of a familiar butler addressing the young couple. The butler asked how they got to the imperial palace. The expression on the butler's face showed that he was nervous and surprised. But Cassian calmly said that the butler asked in such a way as if His Highness had no right to be here. Dvoretsky already regretted that he had asked His Highness about the purpose of his visit, so he quickly apologized and assured that His Highness had every right to be here. Then, in order to prolong their conversation, the Duke explained that he had come with his wife for an audience with the Emperor of the Western Empire. Dvoretsky was a little nervous and didn't know what to say. But then he said that the Emperor was a little sick, so they would have to wait a little for the meeting. Annoyed and angry, the man ran out of the room. He cursed as he passed the guards. A few minutes ago, he got a kick from the Emperor himself. He shouted at him and asked why he didn't know what the second Mackenzie prince was doing. Then the angry Emperor asked his son, does he realize that he is the crown prince? At last the Emperor shouted for this wretched fool to pull himself together. Edward, the crown prince of the Northern Empire, was angry and humiliated because his father always called him pathetic. Annoyed, Edward flew out of the Emperor's room in such a mood that he was ready to blow up this cursed palace. The butler tried to calm the crown prince somehow. The butler told Edward that he shouldn't act like that because the Emperor might hear it. But the angry crown prince shouted that he was not afraid of the Emperor. But the butler only repeated so that His Highness would calm down and behave more quietly. But just as Edward's foot touched the statue to knock it to the floor, one of the servants announced that the Duke of Ternugin had arrived. The crown prince stopped and began to listen to the announcement. He knew that His Highness was busy and had to come here a little later. Therefore, he wanted to know why Cassian had come so suddenly. He asked the butler if Cassian had really arrived. The butler confirmed the Duke's arrival. Edward then said that the Duke had recently married. Butler said that he remembers that Cassian got married and asked if only Mackenzie really went to the wedding. Edward angrily replied that he had no idea where to go. Cassian chose for his wife. Cassian and Arna were in the waiting room. There were cups of tea in front of them, but no one drank it. At that time, everyone was thinking about his own. Cassian was collecting in his mind the general picture of what was happening in the last days. It was known that the Emperor of the Western Empire had sent Duke Sarno. It was taught that he came here to threaten with bribes. He sent men to attack Arna's carriage. But thanks to the Master of the Sword, Arna managed to survive, and the whole game, which had been so carefully played out on the board until that day, went to hell. Because of such a fiasco, The emperor is now unleashing his fury on the most defenseless man, the crown prince. When Cassian put together the general picture in his head, he smiled with satisfaction. Now everything fell into place. Surprised, Arne just watched her husband. Arnie called His Highness, and he returned from his thoughts to reality. He looked at his wife with a serious look. Arnie was surprised at such a quick change in His Highness's mood. That's why I changed my mind about asking him at first. But then she made up her mind and asked when they would be able to see the Emperor of the Northern Empire. After all, they had already been sitting in the reception room for 4 hours, hoping for a quick meeting. Cassian looked at his wife and realized how uncomfortable she was sitting here for so long. Therefore, Cassian said that the Emperor was uncertain and indeed not well, and he offered his wife a walk in the garden. Arnie was very happy when she went outside. Sitting in one position for so long was simply unbearable. Now she stretched deliciously to stretch her muscles. A young girl was walking along a path in a beautiful garden and noticed that the trees here were unusually low. She would like to climb a tree now and have a good rest. Approaching another tree, Arne began to examine it, looking for a good place to rest. But suddenly a man crept up behind her and whispered in her ear that she should listen to him immediately. Arnie turned around and immediately gave him a 2 with 1 right. Confused, the man flew away and fell to the ground. He stared open-mouthed at the young girl who had dealt him such a blow that even grown men had never beaten him. The girl's strength and her fragile appearance did not fit into his head. Edward held his cheek, which was burning terribly. The crown prince kept his eyes on the beautiful beauty and wondered where such a beautiful angel came from in this garden. Arnie was already regretting that she had hit the young man so hard, so she came closer and asked if everything was okay with him. At first, he just blinked his eyes and then answered that yes. The crown prince decided to use this opportunity to learn more about this beauty. He asked her where such strange angels lived. Arne did not understand the question. The girl was used to military feats, not to courtships, so at first she thought that maybe some crazy person was in front of her. The young man got up and asked the girl if he could find out the name of such a beauty. Arne, of course, thought that she had no desire to tell this young man her name. The young girl had already begun to think about how to get out of here, because she really didn't want to continue the conversation with this stranger. The crown prince thought that the young girl was only pretending that she did not know His Highness, because how could you be in this estate and not know the crown prince? That's why he simply offered to give his name. Here they both heard 2 men running towards them and shouting, "His Highness! His Highness!" Edward turned to see his guards. He explained to the young girl that she herself should understand that he is a very busy person and he does not have an extra minute. But before he could turn his head, the young girl disappeared somewhere. Arne, of course, did not have to wait, and when the right opportunity arose, she quickly took advantage of it and fled to the castle. Cassian continued to sit in the waiting room. He was completely in his thoughts. So many things had happened in the last few days that he needed to think about everything. A cup of tea had already been asked, but he was never invited to a meeting. He understood that the meeting would not take place today. Therefore, he thought that there would be an appointment soon. Then it might be worth making an agreement. Cassian heard the sound of footsteps and was glad that his wife had finally returned. He called her by name, but heard back that it was not her. A butler stood before him. The butler informed Cassian that the crown prince was looking for him, who wanted to see him, as soon as he learned that Cassian had arrived at the palace. Cassian wondered why Edward needed to meet him. After all, until today, there was no special relationship between them. The butler bowed and announced that it was Edward who insisted on the meeting. Cassian said that if he was here, he wouldn't mind seeing his brother. The Duke could see how the butler wanted to say something else to him, but did not dare. He just started talking about his wife, and the Duke said that she was out for a walk in the garden. His Highness had already directly asked the butler what exactly he wanted to tell him. But he just shifted from foot to foot and did not know how to start a conversation. Finally, the butler began his speech. He said that perhaps Cassian was already in the know, and lately there had been more attacks on high society ladies. The butler informed that Count Thessalaka is gathering information, but it is not as easy as it seems at first glance, so he needs the help of His Highness. But suddenly the door opened and Edward appeared on the threshold. He shouted Cassian's name and ran to him at full speed. Cassian whispered into the butler's ear that he would speak to Count Thessalaka himself, so there was no need to worry about it. The butler understood everything and went to the exit. The excited crown prince ran to Cassian. The Duke said he was glad to see him and that they had not seen each other for a long time. Cassian then asked why he was so excited, and Edward began to tell the Duke that he had finally met his ideal image of a woman. It happened recently, and she looks like a real angel. Cassian thought about it and asked himself if he was sure that she was the true ideal, and Edward said that he met the woman of his dreams on the way to him. She is just perfect, and he is sure that it is love at first sight. Cassian became interested in seeing for himself the beauty who won the crown prince's heart at first sight. Edward said he wanted to ask her name but didn't have time. He had just turned his head to his guards when she disappeared, as if dissolving into thin air. He regrets so much that he didn't get to spend more time with her, and then he said that this girl has one very special feature, so he can quickly find her among thousands of other girls. Edward explained that silver hair that sparkles in the sun and red eyes are an extremely rare combination, so he recognizes her from 1,000 young girls. Just when he was describing the appearance of the girl of his dreams, the door to the room opened and Arna entered with her nanny. She became a follower of this conversation, so she stopped. Cassian saw his beauty enter the room and a smile appeared on his face. He could no longer control his emotions in her presence. Edward noticed the Duke smiling at someone and also turned his head to see who had come. But what was his surprise when the girl of his dreams entered the room? He was almost speechless. The crown prince immediately grabbed her hand. He didn't even believe in his luck. He didn't even have to organize a grandiose search for his beauty, whom he fell in love with at first sight. Arna was frightened and did not know how to react. Edward very joyfully shouted that she was the same angel whom fate had gifted him to meet today. The crown prince said that it was just fate bringing them together again, and she herself found him in this palace. Cassian decided not to wait for further action, but simply walked up to Arna and hugged her. Edward's eyes widened several times. He did not expect such arrogance from his brother. How dare he touch his angel, of course he would like to ask. But Cassian immediately delicately explained that he did not have time to introduce Edward to his legal wife, Arna. The Duke decided to hold on to the young girl with both hands so that his brother would understand that she was his. Shocked, Edward just blinked his eyes. He did not expect such a reason. His lips only automatically uttered the word wife, which cut his broken heart like a knife. Cassian confirmed once more that she was his wife and offered to say hello to Terneuzen's new mistress and his lawful wife. Cassian also offered his wife to say hello to his cousin and prince of the Northern Empire, Edward. Arna was also a little embarrassed that she hit the prince, so the young girl greeted Edward with her head down. He cheerfully greeted each other. He still could not believe that his angel was already in a legal relationship with his brother. In the end, the meeting with the emperor never happened. Exhausted, Arna went to the garden to at least regain her strength and rest. She had never felt so exhausted after the battles. Arna's attention was drawn by some commotion. She got up and looked closely. Crave stood nearby, and around him was a whole bunch of maids who surrounded him from all sides. Of course, the young man liked the girl's attention very much. Therefore, he happily introduced himself and added that he was guarding Duchess Arne. The maids showered him with compliments, admired his good looks, and told stories about how he bravely fought off a bunch of thieves and single-handedly saved the Duchess. But his gaze met with one of the maids. She was looking at him so intently that it was as if she wanted to burn Crave right through. Crave dug into his memory and realized that she had met before. And the case when they had to meet closer, he did not like at all. He remembered how she had followed him with Arna, back when he was disguised as a maid, and they discussed how they had almost gotten caught the last time they met. Crave decided, as always, to turn everything into a joke, because only this method helped him more than once in uncomfortable situations. So he asked the maid if something stuck to his face. The maid thought about her own and also tried to remember where they had seen each other before, because she had definitely met those eyes somewhere before. Therefore, she asked if they could not have seen each other somewhere before. Crave immediately began to deny their acquaintance and said that they definitely could not have seen each other before. But the maid insisted that she had seen his face before. Crave started joking about the fact that she probably just likes him, and she couldn't find a better way to show her sympathy. But the maid said that she didn't want to bump into the knight at all. She just knew his face, but she couldn't remember where exactly she saw him. Erica began to remember exactly where. Crave thought that maybe they met when they were in the imperial palace. and the maid thought, but could not remember such a savage among the guards. Crave tried to change the topic of the conversation as soon as possible, because if Eric remembers that he dressed up as a maid, things will be really bad for him. Arna had seen Crave try very hard to avoid unnecessary conversation, but her mood had already soured. She also understood that if he was exposed, it would be the end of her secret. A few more days passed. In 10 days, a ball was to be held in the imperial palace, so everyone was preparing for such an event. Cassian also stopped by to ask how the preparations were going. Arnie answered that no special preparation was necessary. She is going to wear some dress from those she has, so there is absolutely no need to worry about it. Nanny almost exploded with anger when she heard that Arna was going to the Emperor's ball to dress up in old clothes. At first, she looked at Arna with her evil look. That girl didn't even pay attention to her. Then Eva decided to say out loud that it was absolutely impossible to allow such a thing, and she did not raise her that way. Cassian just watched as the nanny explained to Arnie that this high society was a very scary place. And in no case can you become a laughingstock here, because it will stick for the rest of your life. Arnie even closed her ears, because the nanny was telling her about social life so loudly that it was simply unbearable to listen to. Arna asked if it was so important how she would look. The nanny saw that her arguments had no effect on the young girl, so she threatened to contact her mother immediately and tell her everything. Cassian watched silently as the nanny tried to prove to Arna that this would not be just another party, but an important event. Therefore, he offered his help in this matter. And a few hours later, a woman visited Arnie, who introduced herself as Agatha and explained that she had been sent to her by Duke Cassian himself. The woman also added that she is usually called Gata or Marquise. Arna just looked at this strange woman and realized that the more she talked, the more I reminded her of my mother. When Agatha fell silent, she was of course waiting for her interlocutor to answer. And Arna just greeted the strange woman. Agatha examined the Duchess from head to toe with an appraising look, and only asked what kind of strange greeting this was, and if this is how they are greeted in the Western Empire. Arna said yes.